good morning and a very warm welcome to the Scotland Agronomy Roadshow here on Thursday, the 20th of January. My name is Richard Meredith. I'm the head of Arable Knowledge Exchange at AHDB, and it's my great honour to chair this event with you all today. You'll see a few logos up there on the screen in front of you. It's a real joint effort to bring it all together, and all the speakers and all the content for you today. It goes without saying, we would love to have been in a hotel, in a venue with you, having some shortbread and coffee right now, but circumstances weren't to be, and we've moved everything online to ensure that we're still delivering for you all today. Just the kind of the routine housekeeping points. These sessions are really driven by your questions and your thoughts and comments. So please don't be afraid to write into the chat box and the Q&A box any questions or thoughts that you'd like us to articulate as we go through to our speakers. Depending on time, how we get on, I'll ask each speaker some questions as we go through, but then we'll have a wider session at the end to kind of all discuss some relevant topics. Just to confirm, we can't hear or see you, so don't panic. The session is recorded, so if you're frantically writing any notes and trying to keep up, do keep in mind that it is all recorded, and you can revisit it afterwards. So I'm going to run through the agenda in a moment. We go to just after 12:30 with the presentations, and then we'll have the end session at the end with the panel discussion. We're hoping to close by 1 p.m. At the latest, so we're aiming to keep to that. One housekeeping point for you all, if you're collecting basis and Rosso CPD points, that's to put your details into the Q&A box. Now there's two boxes, the Q&A box and the chat box. Make sure that you please put that in the Q&A box, otherwise everybody will see your details. So for basis, it's name, basis account number and your postcode, and for Naroso it's the same, it's name, Naroso number, but your date of birth and your postcode. So just to really reiterate, if you put that into the Q&A box, not the chat box, and we'll pick those up, we'll fill out the forms and send them in so you collect your points for joining us today. So we've already done one of the road shows, that was on Tuesday, and that was looking at the kind of practical tips and messages for 2022. That will soon go on to the website, the recording of that, so if you missed that, it's still available. Obviously we're here today, we're looking at more improved sustainable production methods, and then please do join us again on the 26th of January next week, where we're having this session really kind of with short, sharp updates from the speakers I put up on the screen here. We've got some farmer case studies coming in to really talk about what they're doing, and a big discussion at the end of it all, so it should be an exciting session to say the least. So that's 26th of January at the same time. Just if you can indulge me in a very quick AHDB update. It's a very important year for AHDB. You have the opportunity as cereals and oilseeds and AHDB dairy levy payers in Scotland to vote for what the future of the organisation looks like for you. It's a vote where you go through and look at all the products, tools and services that AHDB offer, and really kind of have your say on what you do use and what you don't use, and what provides value for your business and what doesn't, and that really kind of helps the organisation shape into something that which you require and which you need for your business. I don't want to stress it, overstress it. I can't stress it. We really need to get you all to do this. It's very important to have your say into what it looks like. The time frames creeping up on us. The registration to do this closes at the end of March. I've done it for our business at home, and this is the form here. It takes a mere few minutes just to put your details in. When the registration opens in March, then it automatically contacts you. Just a date for your diary, Tuesday the 5th of July, you've got the Arable Scotland event, which is held with SRUC, AHDB and James Hutton Institute, and then there's some other supporting institutions there at the bottom, so there's a lot of people involved. If you're sat in your office now and you're next to your calendar, cross off that day, Tuesday the 5th of July. Should be an exciting day as always, so if you get that into your diaries. Right, I won't eat too much more into our valuable time with the speakers for today. I put up the agenda here of what we're going to be doing. We're going to Julian Bell first, where we're going to be talking about achieving net zero and all things carbon and how we approach that. Then we've got Ian Bingham and George Chalmers talking about the research and then the pricing of fertiliser and how that all kind of ties up together. It's really kind of quite a big topic for the arable sector at the moment. And then Henry Kryson joining us to talk about IPM and how you measure your IPM and to make decisions on your business. And then finally, we've got an international speaker, Yelton Kuno from the Agri Benchmark network, and he's going to be talking to us about what makes international competitiveness in cereals and oilseeds, and what does that look like. Yelton is part of a big network that pulls together different data from different countries around the world, and so it should be an exciting session to say the least. So without any further ado, I'll hand over I'll stop sharing and I'll hand over to Julian. And Julian, I think you want to put your slides up. I'll give you the floor.
Great, thank you. So morning everyone, good to be speaking to you all today. And so my part of the presentation is to give a bit of an overview of carbon emissions and how that the sort of overall issues around that and how that can affect the arable sector, and sort of try to identify some of the priorities of how we can sort of maybe cut emissions and the benefits of doing that. Later speakers are going to start drilling into a lot of the technical areas that will be crucial to help achieve that. So hopefully this will give a bit of an overview, and we can take it from there. So just to get started, just a minute for a quick sort of poll, I suppose, of what the audience are thinking about, net zero, low carbon. How does that sort of feed into their thoughts of the future for arable farming and their own farm? And really, do you think that's going to be positive in the end? Perhaps, maybe not too much difference, or will it be negative for your farm business or the farm businesses you're involved in? What's your sort of current view of that? So Gemma's put up a poll, so if you take a wee minute just to give your opinion on that, that'd be great. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Gemma. That's, oh, do we see the results just very quickly? It's fairly balanced, perhaps a little bit more neutral. So 31% positive, 46% neutral, and 23% negative. So a wee bit of a reasonable balance there, but certainly not, there's a wee bit of optimism there, but obviously a bit of caution. So perhaps quite a interesting result there. So thanks everyone. That gives a wee bit of a feedback of what everyone's thinking. So yeah, so clearly there are a number of challenges, a number of opportunities. So there's a lot more to find out about how this is all going to work. But it's good to have sort of open mind about where this might lead. So I won't say too much about this. This is clearly what the national, certainly from the UK's point of view, the national scenario is to reduce emissions from agriculture alongside all the other sectors. And Scotland's developing its own sort of targets more locally. Now, certainly on a policy level, it's just worth bearing in mind that the policymakers aren't actually expecting farmers to get to zero. They're expecting some reductions. They're expecting a certain amount of offsetting, whether it's through soil, through woodlands and things, offsetting some of those emissions. But they're not expecting farm emissions to become zero on their own, because you are dealing with a lot of biological processes, nitrous oxides from soils, fertiliser, manures, you've got methane from animals. So although these targets are stretching, there is a reasonable amount of reality about them, and that's also important that the farm industry does sort of, and the research and science do help make sure these targets are realistic. I think some of the retail chains have perhaps pushed these targets a little bit harder than the government's actually necessarily expecting, and that may be where some of the challenges lie. And yeah, so I think obviously for the grain, particularly focus on the grain sector at the moment for the meeting today, the big one in Scotland, that the big industry that's sort of working in a sort of reasonably coordinated way is the Scotch whisky industry, and that's taking 40–45% or even 50% of the grain in Scotland. So whatever their strategy is going to be important. They are They've developed environmental strategies. They've got a net zero sort of target, pretty well in line with the government here in Scotland. But obviously, it'll be down to individual member companies exactly how that's put forward. So I thought it'd be interesting to sort of look at, what's the share of emissions across the whisky supply chain. So to produce malt whisky, that's a sort of split of where all the emissions are coming from. So barley production, just under 40%. You've got the malting, which is obviously very energy intensive, mostly gas at the moment for sort of drying and heating. The distilling, clearly that's a big energy user with the distillation process, and then feed processing. Although that is a sort of moving feast at the moment, because a lot of the distillers have switched away from sort of pelletizing a lot of the feeds, and they're using more renewable energy. So the whisky sector itself is working on the emissions that it's controlling within its own business. So as we look forward, the agricultural side becomes more relevant, or potentially a bigger share, depending on what progress the farming sector can make. So yeah, as a supply chain, it's a shared sort of issue in terms of all the emissions. But we're moving to the point where each part of the chain is going to have to look at its own share. I think for many farmers in the audience, the question is, well, how's that going to be incentivized or motivated so that we can actually have a reason to do it on farm? Now, if we sort of then home in on the barley itself, where are the emissions coming from? The production of fertiliser is around about a third. So all the energy intensive production of ammonium nitrate and other fertilisers. Now, this is a bit of an example here. So this doesn't necessarily apply to all farms, but just a sort of model. There's potential if you just take some of the cultivations on its own for some loss of soil carbon, depending on what happens to straw. But obviously, you'll see later that can obviously be changed quite significantly depending how the farm manage the soil. So potentially some loss there from the cultivations from soil. Then there's a nitrous oxide from the fertiliser and potentially manures. So between them, the nitrogen thing is huge. So obviously, it'd be really helpful to find out a bit more in the next session. You've got lime, and then things like energy, which largely fuel in field cultivation. Now, lime, when we sort of actually look at emissions per tonne, then lime's a very productive input, because when we start looking at emissions per tonne, then we've really got to maintain output. So inputs, we're not really looking at cutting inputs per se, we're just looking at using them more efficiently or having alternative sources that have got lower emissions, because we certainly want to maintain production. That's the whole role of agriculture, and obviously as a profitable business, we've got to maintain output. So lime is important there. Now, this is just to illustrate some of the actions that farmers could take just in an overall way. The nitty-gritty of this is obviously more complicated, but just to give an idea of where we could take that barley crop being grown. Standard practices, I say, we've taken data from AgriCalc, the carbon calculator, and we're coming in around sort of just under 400 kilos of CO2 per tonne of barley being produced. Now, start reducing cultivation, retain the straw. You can start to reduce or eliminate any losses from the soil. Once you get down to, zero tillage has certainly quite a few issues. Again, technically, it's easy to say these things. Practically, it's a very different story. But just following the science, if tillage is reduced and more organic matter retained, you can certainly maintain the soil carbon levels within that arable rotation. The first step, better yields, 10% on yields. Again, it leads to better nitrogen efficiency. And start looking at scavenging nitrogen over the winter, say with a spring barley crop, some cover crops, just to save, it's 10 or 15 kilos of nitrogen from being lost. Again, that has a reasonable effect. You can then move into other measures, nitrification inhibitors, which help reduce the loss of nitrous oxide from the application of fertiliser. So, it is a desktop exercise, this one. We need to do more in the field work to see what can actually be achieved. But here you're talking potentially 50% reduction in emissions Reality might be, 10 to 30% on most farms, let's say, but over time, there is that sort of potential there. And as I say, the devil's in the detail of exactly how you get all this to work on an individual farm. But it's interesting to see the variation there. Now, just to move in on one or two of these points, well, yield's pretty obviously what key one if we're looking at carbon emissions per tonne. So in terms of, say, supplying the whiskey industry, what they want is to have the barley supplied with lower emissions. So clearly yields are number one. And I think in all the advice that we or anyone else is giving to farmers or speaking to farmers about, it's maintaining output, or certainly maintaining profitable output, which isn't always the same as yield, clearly, but the business has got to maintain its output or its profitability. So yield is one area that you can certainly home in on. And this, a bit of an example, just the shift to the newer varieties that we've had. We're moving away from Concerto. Okay, yields are a wee bit down this year, but certainly the 2 years before that, Concerto seemed to be making quite a difference. You're adding, sort of quarter to half a tonne an acre. So you're adding around 10%. So all else being equal, and generally the new varieties aren't necessarily requiring any more inputs particularly. Certainly you're then getting better nitrogen use efficiency, and that's a 10% gain or reduction in your carbon emissions per tonne. So, this is aligned with what farmers are really obviously trying to do, be more productive and get better use out of your resources. Again, that leads to lower carbon. Now, the soil is crucial to a lot of this. Now, there is a sort of emphasis, which I'll explain a wee bit more about, the actual soil capturing carbon in itself. But we would probably argue that alongside that, there's a huge benefit from improving the soil structure, because that can actually, in its own right, save a lot of carbon. So if we can build up a bit of organic matter in the soil, improve productivity or structure of the soil, that can give better yields. You can lock up carbon, but better yields, more resilient crops. You can access moisture in sort of dry years. You can withstand a bit more wetter conditions. You can get machinery onto fields, the structure is better, and better for capturing nutrients and recycling them. Again, anything to sort of trim down sort of nitrogen use or other fertilizers. So soil is really key to cutting emissions, but perhaps not necessarily from just capturing the carbon itself. So I think that's a crucial thing too. And we've seen that in results. Higher farms with, certainly farms with a bit of grassland in the mix, have stood out pretty well in sort of dry years compared to farms that have maybe worked their organic matter down through sort of arable, more intensive rotations. So AgriCalc, we have a soil carbon module. It is a model, so there are some limitations which I'll just touch on a bit later. But essentially, we're trying to calculate based on IPCC. There's a method there. What's the starting stock of carbon? Is that land changing use? How is it being managed? And is there other inputs going onto the land in terms of manures, straw, and things like that going back? Obviously, big management practice would be things like cultivation, cover crops, retention of stubbles and things. Oops. And the principle being, if a farm moves from one sort of management state to another, the potential is there to either sort of build up the organic matter or reduce it, and it's divided over a 20-year period. So that's how our model works. Now, the reality on the ground can be quite different, and there is quite a, we've just got to be a wee bit careful about modelling soil carbon. The module we've got, it's there to try and give farmers an indication of what they're doing is, broadly speaking, going to help build organic matter, whether it's maybe going to maintain it or whether there's a risk that it might be eroding it. So it's really just more of a signpost, I suppose, to how management is affecting or may be affecting soil carbon. As I say, and that's all positive in terms of if you can build soil carbon, then there's all these other benefits. But modelling is limited. There are some limits clearly, and in the end, sort of robust soil sampling and analysis is the only way to to actually categorically demonstrate that that the soil is going in one direction or another. And that may well take some time to become clear. There's a huge volume of soil to deal with, even to 30 centimeters, and quite often you're talking relatively small changes in organic matter going into the soil. So that's the challenge in the longer run, is to get good, accurate figures to what's really happening in the soil. Now, I think in terms of carbon being a metric that's going to be useful in the farming business, we need some more standardization. There's a soil carbon code that's under development. There are a number of initiatives to try and bring consistency to this, to how this is measured. And clearly, as we move towards maybe a commercial environment where that will become important, whether it's government schemes or private funded sort of trading things, we really do need some standards. So that's becoming pretty clear, and there is work in that area. And yeah, we're just trying to think of a wee bit of common sense approach to some of this. There are a lot of proposals and offers and things being put out there by various sort of groups and things, sort of saying to farmers, look, you can capture carbon, we can find a market for it. Which it's an interesting development, and that may well turn out to be a useful additional benefit to some farm businesses. But I think as an individual business, I think it's just worth asking a few questions before going too far with this. I think we do need an official way, a robust official way of actually capturing, recording a carbon code. So we do need that in place before we can be too confident that it's on a firm basis. We do need to find out more what the government are wanting, what are future schemes, what are they going to require farmers, and what are farmers' rights and responsibilities going to be. If carbon credits can be generated, maybe they're going to be needed elsewhere, even within the farming business, and they may not necessarily be available for sale. And the other crucial thing is there's quite a risk of selling early, because the value of carbon offsets is only going to increase, because as the world starts making more progress towards cutting emissions, then any offsets, or the value of those, is simply going to increase. So you don't want to be selling too early in this market, and you've also got to make sure that you don't necessarily need some of those credits yourself in the future. So yeah, a common sense approach, I think, is all I think people really should just be trying adopting. Now, let's move on to a wee bit more. I think I'm just going to touch on one or two other areas, but the key thing is know where you are as a farming business. So if you use a carbon tool and you get some benchmarks, AgriCalc provides those. We provide validated benchmark data, so all the data in AgriCalc is being checked, and anything a bit not correct has been excluded as far as we can. And from that information, that you start to see some hotspots, strengths and weaknesses of different crops. So this is an example of a matrix that AgriCalc generates. So whether the farmers themselves are using this information, or they've got some help to look at this and work out areas to target. So from this, you can start to see areas that maybe require attention, and you can start to see how you compare with other crops. Now, I think this is a practical example. We can start to apply sort of knowledge of strengths and weaknesses on a sort of spatial scale as well. So the first that's an overview, but I think to actually make progress, you need to start drilling into individual crops, individual fields. So this is an example of spatial data showing yield maps, essentially, and starting to identify sort of parts of the field that are maybe not performing. So that's step one. And the illustration here is that, different parts of the field are yielding very differently. So, and they have, where yields aren't making expected levels, that's driving up the cost of production, and it's clearly bringing higher carbon emissions per ton. So if you can identify some of those areas, and say, right, can we either address those weaknesses, or can we just modify the area that we crop? Is it really worth cropping some of those headlands or wet patches, etc.? Could that go into another scheme? Now, I know this has obviously been something that farmers have done for many years, but as we get more and better spatial data, it's actually, it's possible to fine-tune that even further. So you can see here, there's a couple of patches that are really, the yields are just dipping below, quite a lot below what's required. So, and this illustrates how just dropping that wet corner or that shaded corner can actually bump up the yields from 7.2 to 7.5 tonnes a hectare. And of course, then the tractor's not running over that land, the fuel's not being used, the fertiliser isn't getting spread, the seed's not going on that patch. And that's really going to just help reduce the emissions per tonne of grain per kilo. So again, just making farming better with better knowledge and information. Now, I think I've got one or two examples later. You know, these look obviously clear, like no very simple, straightforward decisions to make. But you know, there's time and money required to get spatial data. There's the investment in management time to work out what to do and how to change things. So they are obviously clearly going to be beneficial in the long run, but there's a certain amount of time needed to get familiar with this and get data and things. So it's not without any cost. And I think, yeah, it's probably not my area particularly, but obviously there are a lot of practical areas that can be tackled to sort of try and get those other areas back up to speed, back up to yield. And I think in terms of opportunities, it's just worth highlighting a few other areas. So this is an example of pigs, pig feed, or pig feed within the whole emissions of pigs, and poultry very similar, or in fact it's even greater. The feed is an even greater proportion of poultry rations or poultry emissions. And again, it's an opportunity if we can grow crops that are going to reduce the emissions of the grain or the protein that's going into the pig and poultry. That's actually the single biggest thing that those pig and poultry units can do. They can manage their own business, but actually the single biggest thing they can do is source from a low carbon source of feed. And the chances are that's more than likely to be a farm next door. And and the other part of it is once you fully capture the manures going back to the crops and the crops going into the livestock, that actually drives a sort of virtuous circle of driving down emissions. So you end up getting lower emission grain going to the animals, and then the manures obviously cut down the bag fertilizer that those crops need. So for neighbouring businesses or integrated business, that's a big area to focus on, and that's certainly an area agriculture focuses on mixed farms. There's a lot of benefit there. Then there are sort of the things that may be a bit more challenging, but maybe to try and grow more proteins. Again, climate doesn't necessarily help, but clearly the opportunities are there. Will there be enough of a premium to help get into some of these other crops? Now, just to illustrate the challenge, I've got an example here from a farm report that we did. So this is a milling wheat, soft milling wheat grower. We were looking at, the farmers looking at ways that they could cut emissions, because their end user was very interested in saying, right, okay, what can you do to bring down the emissions of your grain? It's quite early days in this case. They're not, at some point, they're going to have a discussion about, okay, the farmers supplying this milling wheat, what's going to be on the table? Is there going to be a premium on the table so that we will take these steps and reduce carbon? But we looked at a number of things here. If they can, the more they could swap out fertilizer for hen pen, that had quite a major effect in terms of carbon emissions. And the idea was to try and make sure that was carbon neutral, cost neutral. So sort of 6% reduction from that in terms of per ton of wheat. The use of more precision applications, leaf sampling, that kind of thing. Again, new equipment, more time, management time. There wasn't without cost, but again, that was quite a significant reduction in emissions, 6% there, because nitrogen sort of 80% of the crop's emissions. And then moving into things like nitrification inhibitors, which are higher cost fertiliser but have chemicals in there that will help damp down nitrous oxide emissions, again up to 13% emissions saving. And the one that on the face of it seemed like a really good idea was to swap field beans out and put them in instead of oats. Because obviously you'd cut fertiliser use, the following wheat crop would get some nitrogen, extra nitrogen in the soil. It was all looking good, but unfortunately, the only crop they could take out to put the beans in was winter oats, and they were a pretty good paying crop for milling, and so actually the cost was relatively high. So that cost benefit per ton of wheat, you could see, hopefully the manures would be pretty well cost neutral. The nitrogen, well, that was before prices hiked, so maybe this would be a wee bit different now, actually, of course. The nitrogen, more precision technology was a small cost, £2 or £3 a ton, and the nitrification inhibitors is quite similar. But the beans, switching them out of the rotation was £26 a ton of wheat. So that was obviously off the table. And then you could see the sort of relative cost per ton of carbon saved. So quite early days on this front, but these are the sort of steps that will have to be taken so that farmers can start understanding what they can do, what the costs are, and identifying, is there a market for it? What is the going rate for these things, these savings, if I'm going to go and do them? Some will pay for themselves, but others will take some investment from whether it's the market or government support. Now, just to really sort of conclude fairly soon, there's a kind of timing matrix, I suppose you could think about. And I think like anything in life, if you start measuring it, you go, oh, well, hang on a minute, I didn't realize. And you can start to make a few savings just by having good information. So carbon baseline with AgriCalc or whatever tool is being used, the first point of call is just saying, okay, where are my emissions coming from? How do they compare? That information alone usually sparks a few ideas, areas to tackle. And that's pretty quick. Within a year or two, you can spot a few things that might need change on the farm relatively, and that will bring us, in terms of carbon savings, that's probably in the sort of 10 to 15%, maybe at max, maybe 5 to 10%. This might then spur some changes in practices that could take longer to implement, and the savings might be another 5 or 10%. Beyond that, things start to be a bit more difficult. You might need a new, min-till drill or something, or invest in other equipment, or make a major sort of rotational change, etc. That could well have a payback, but it might be 5 years or something, commercial payback. So that's a bigger step to take. And going beyond that, maybe we've of course had capital grant schemes already in Scotland for this kind of activity, so that obviously helps lower the barrier there, and that may well be something that comes more in the future. So there's all these things can be progressed with relatively, in the end, benefits the profits of the business. But there are steps we start to say, well, there is actually a cost, like inhibitors, some other mitigation measures where there is a cost, and that's sort of the unknown at the moment. Where's that payment going to come from? But clearly the next sort of 2 to 5 years, there's a reasonable amount to go at for most farms, and which should in the end improve the bottom line. So really just to recap, obviously quite a reasonably balanced view from the audience today. Yeah, there's some benefits, might be some downsides, probably not quite sure yet. Some people sitting on the fence. It's coming quite quickly. The consumers, the governments are now pushing lower carbon sectors, products, industries. Whiskey is saying it wants to reduce emissions, and barley will, over time, potentially be a bigger share of that. But equally, there's actually a lot of steps that can potentially over the next 5 to 10 years be implemented more widely on farms. Some have got a cost, some are simply better practices. We'll hear more about that later today. I think in terms of the business, how quickly are they going to be demanded? Will there be a cost? Can the business adapt over time and remain, profitable? There are some opportunities. The livestock sector, if it really gets squeezed, it's going to have to cut emissions. Then certainly pigs and poultry, they're going to have to focus more on feeds, and that's a role for neighbouring farmers, for other farmers growing more proteins, for instance. Yeah, and I think we're all at the point now saying, well, okay, well, what are these incentives? What is the cost benefit on my farm going to be? And what's coming forth from the buyers and government? So we're kind of at that. There's one or two examples starting to come out, but I think there's a lot of all sides in this equation, whether the farmers, the governments, the marketplace, are all still at that sort of dancing around, trying to work out what is the tangible cost benefit there. So I hope that gave a wee bit of an overview of carbon, and yeah, we'll look forward to any questions later on. Thank you.
Julian, thank you very much. Do you mind if I ask you a couple of questions now? We've got a couple of minutes.
No problem.
And I'll save some for the session at the end. First of all, easy one to start with. When is AgriCalc going to take account of crop sequestration?
Well, it does. We have got a module at the moment. So so far it's been for groups that have sort of requested it, because we're actually revising it again at the moment. So we have been using it in groups, including some of the AHDB farms, but we are revising it at the moment. So, and then we'll make it more widely available. But it's using it on farms, thrown up a few things that we hadn't quite expected. So it's certainly benefited from using it on. I think we've used it on a few hundred farms so far, more in sort of smaller groups.
You mentioned in the middle there, Julian, the need for standardisation in how we measure this. That's not going to happen immediately. What advice would you give to farmers at the moment in terms of approaching use different tools? You're going to get very different results. What advice would you give in terms of choosing the tool and sticking and I suppose do you try out different tools, or do you stick with one tool for the whole period of when you're doing it? So
I think before you select tool, there's a few basics. Does it follow the accepted science? Has it got any kind of quality assurance? I mean, there are standards. There's past 2050. There's ISO. If it's been externally audited, if it follows IPCC, there are some checklists out there. NFU England's produced one. So to just have a good look at that, and then whatever tool you do choose, then probably stick with that for the time you're using it, because it's from your point of view as a farmer, it's the relative improvements against your baseline that matter most. So clearly, if you find a tool that seems to fit the right criteria for you, then stick with that one and you'll then know how you're improving or changing.
Brilliant. Thank you for independent approach that one. I realise you're attached to the AgriCalc tool as well. So Jason. And last one, can you measure carbon storage, or do any of the tools attempt to do that at all? How you store carbon?
Carbon storage in soils or somewhere else?
Yeah.
Well, you see, in the end, that is the most critical thing, which needs. We calculate it, and we use soil maps, GIS maps to work out your typical soil carbon level. Obviously, we'll be adding. You can put in your own actual recorded soil carbon for your fields, but in the end, the model itself has got limits. So what really is going to have to move towards for everyone is a unified system of standard for measuring, which is sort of emerging, so that everyone's measuring it to the same standard, the same method on a sort of regular basis. And that's the only way in the end that farmers will have a true reflection of what is actually going on their fields. The calculators, the models can help give a bit of a steer as to roughly is it going in the right direction, But when you start to really want to quantify it, and which for government schemes, for retailers or other sort of commercial things, yeah, the sampling is going to be key. And
one last one, I'm going to save the rest for the panel session. Julian, any carbon credits generated on an arable farm are short-term and reversible. With this in mind, their value will be considerably lower than the figures being banded around. Will the Soil Carbon Code take account of this issue, and how will the reversibility be tackled, please? Reversibility, sorry.
Yeah, well, I can't speak for exactly how the current sort of debate is going within those codes, but from other well-established codes like the Woodland Code and the Peatland Code, because there is uncertainty about the science, there is reversibility. They tend to have a sort of buffer. So they might say, yeah, it looks like you're sequestering 100 tons. There's a risk attached to that. We're only going to accept, say, 30% is actually to be, and that allows leakage. It allows, in some cases, reversals and things like that. So I think kind of what you're saying is that, from what you're saying and your other question, that the theoretical potential of carbon capture might be, X, but the bit that you could safely say has been secured and could be traded perhaps is going to be less, and there's going to be more scrutiny. And to make this accurate is a reasonable cost, because it's going to have to be independently assessed. It's going to have to accurately sampled. So those credits will be more expensive to generate, but they may well be worth more. But it's, at the moment, there's quite a very sort of low bar as to what is a soil carbon credit, and the price is it is actually going up, but it will coalesce around sort of fewer but more valuable credits, but they will take more to actually prove that you've actually got them.
I don't know much about the carbon trading yet, and kind of if we're one weather event away from it all kind of going completely wrong on a farm in a year, kind of do they build in a buffer when you're doing this to kind of allow for that?
Well, the codes will, and the codes so far have given us much sort of been very conservative and put in buffers. I mean, yeah, I think it's very much an open question quite where the carbon credit thing is going to lead. But obviously, even within the farming business itself, there's going to be a requirement to justify or demonstrate carbon, whether it's for the government or supply chain. So whether it's traded off the farm or it's simply as part of the farm, it needs that scrutiny and independent assessment, which is, and without that, I think it's a wee bit of a Wild West at the moment until it's a bit clear as to how that can be done fairly and consistently.
Brilliant. Thank you, Julian. We'll be coming back to you later, and you're with us tomorrow as well to kind of revisit some of the top arable priorities. Thank you very much. It's fantastic and journey. Great start to the day.
Thanks.
Julian touched in there on fertiliser and its impact in the picture there. Almost like it was planned, we're now going into a session on focusing on fertiliser with Ian Bingham and George Chalmers. I'll introduce them both now. Ian's from SRUC and George is SAC, and Ian's going to focus on the research and what do we know about the fertiliser use at the moment, and then George is going to be bringing in the kind of the cost and how we kind of go about mitigating the kind of cost of it at the moment, considering how high they are. Ian, if you're happy for me to hand the stage over to you, we'll just need to share your screen and then we'll be ready to go.
That's very, yep, thank you very much. And hopefully you can see that.
Super job, perfect. We'll leave you to it. Thanks, Ian.
Okay, that's grand. Thanks, Richard, and good morning, everybody. Yes, as Richard says, in this session, I'm going to present some results from recent research we've been doing on nitrogen use efficiency in spring barley. And then George will discuss some of the wider aspects of fertiliser use. And And Julian has sort of nicely highlighted the importance of thinking about fertilizer inputs and what we can do to maximise their efficiency, not just from a sort of a carbon point of view, but also from because of the cost point of view. I want to start by just outlining some of the background to the research that we've been doing and the sort of questions that we've been addressing before I then take you through some of the results. And what we can see is that spring barley yields have been rising steadily at about a rate of 0.4 tonnes per hectare per decade, and that's through the work of the breeders generating higher yielding varieties and also through improvements in agronomy. But the question that sort of raises then is should we be treating these higher yielding varieties any differently in terms of their sort of nutrition? There are also, if you look at the British fertiliser survey, this highlights that there's quite a bit of variation amongst farmers in how they time their nitrogen applications. So about 2/3 of them are splitting the nitrogen into 2 splits, but there's still a proportion, quite a large proportion of farmers that are just using a single split. And interestingly, differences between Scotland and England and Wales in terms of the number of crops that get nitrogen into the seedbed. So again, we can ask the question: well, is this appropriate? Can we do better with our timing? And what effect would that have on the nitrogen use efficiency? And a sort of a third area that's become sort of highlighted in the farming press in the last few years are these sort of reports of high efficiency from using foliar nitrogen applications. And there are reports that foliar applications can give you can be 4 times more effective than the equivalent soil applied applications. So using a combination of soil N and foliar N could be a way of lifting the nitrogen use efficiency overall. But we wanted some data of our own on this, so we've just begun a project to start looking into the relative efficiency of foliar and soil applied nitrogen. So I'm going to cover sort of 2 projects. The first project is an AHDB project, and this was reviewing nitrogen and sulfur. Not going to be talking about sulfur here, but reviewing nitrogen recommendations for spring barley with a view to revising the RB209 recommendations. And then the second project is one that we've just started. So this is run for 1 year now, and this is funded by the Mains of Lauriston Trust, and this is the one that's looking at the relative efficiency of foliar and soil applied nitrogen. And these are the questions that I want to address and hopefully provide some answers to this morning. So we were interested in whether rates and timings of nitrogen fertilizer needed to be adjusted according to the variety. Are current fertilizer recommendations into RB209 still appropriate? Do they need to be revised? Can yield and nitrogen use efficiency be increased by improved timing? And as I've mentioned, is foliar nitrogen inherently more efficient than soil applied nitrogen? So those are the questions that we set ourselves. We start with the AHDB project. We ran a number of nitrogen response rate experiments between 2018 and 2020. So there were 11 experiments over 4 different sites across the UK. And in each of these experiments, nitrogen was applied at rates, 6 rates from 0 right through to 360 kilos, because we wanted to get a complete nitrogen response curve. And from that, we were then able to estimate the optimum nitrogen supply to sort of maximize the yield. And this was all done with 3 varieties: Planet, Laureate, and Concerto. But for some of the analysis, we've also combined the data with a review of 13 previously conducted experiments between 2005 and 2017. So we had a larger database to work from. Now, one of the things that the fertilizer recommendations in RB209 do is they allow the rates to be adjusted for the yield that's expected at the site. But there is a certain amount of debate amongst agronomists as to whether this is appropriate. But I think what we see from here, what we've done here is plot the optimum, the N optimum. So this is the optimum nitrogen fertilizer requirement found from those nitrogen response curve against the yield of the crops at those sites. And you can see that there is a broad relationship. So the higher the yield potential of the site, then the greater the nitrogen requirement, the greater the fertilizer optimum. But there is a lot of scatter in these data. So I think we're justified. We can justify making those adjustments for the yield potential of the site. But do we need to also adjust? Do we need to fine tune this for the yield potential of the varieties? These data here were averaged across all the varieties, but what do we need to do with those those new higher yielding varieties? Well, what we found is that there's no need to treat those varieties differently, and this is what Julian highlighted earlier on, is that the modern varieties or the newer varieties, Planet and Laureate, although they were higher yielding than Concerto, you can see from these response curves that the nitrogen optimum, the nitrogen requirement, was pretty much the same. And these are data here. These are just two examples. This is from the East Lothian site in 2018, and we saw the same thing here in 2019. So the higher yielding, but the nitrogen requirement, the fertilizer requirement, is the same. And we can explain that because these newer varieties are more efficient in their use of nitrogen. And these are data that we got from some work we did a few years ago. And this was looking at the effects of breeding for yield on the nitrogen use efficiency of spring barley. So in these experiments, we grew old and new varieties, different dates of introduction, all in the same fields at the same time. And we saw, you can see with the new varieties here, there was an increase in their nitrogen use efficiency. So breeding had sort of increased that nitrogen use efficiency by about 1% per year. And that's partly to do with the fact that they're more efficient at the capture of nitrogen, but they also utilize that nitrogen more efficiently in their production of grain. So we also wanted to know whether the current RB209 recommendations were still appropriate. So we combined the data from the sort of new experiments with those that were sort of relatively recent, but from previous projects. And those data, the nitrogen responses that we got from that were giving us an average optimum nitrogen rate of 122 kilos per hectare. But what we compared those nitrogen optima with was what would be recommended by the RB209. And we found that on average that the RB209 was overestimating the nitrogen requirement by about 40 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. I mean, there's a lot of error in this. So some were overestimating at some sites and some were underestimating, but on average, there was a general overestimation. And so I think there's some scope here for revising those recommendations, and that will help improve the efficiency of fertilizer use. In terms of the nitrogen timing experiments, within the same project, we had 11 experiments across 3 or 4 sites, and we were growing 4 varieties in this case: Planet, Laureate, Concerto, and Diablo. And at a given site, the nitrogen was selected according to the site potential, so that'd be the previous cropping and the soil type, and also the expected yield. but we varied the timing. So this is just an example here for the East Lothian site. So this particular site, all the crops were given 120 kilos of nitrogen, but we varied the timing in this way here. So in one set of treatments, all the nitrogen was applied to the seed bed. In what we call the RB209 timing treatment, a third was applied to the seed bed, and 2/3 was sort of tillering up to growth stage 30. A late treatment was where it was all applied between GS 13 and 30, and then we had what we called a little and often treatment. So it was split 3 ways all the way up to sort of growth stage 39. So we had quite a range of nitrogen treatments in this work. And what we found was that yes, there was a significant effect of timing on the yield. So the late timing, perhaps not surprisingly, gave us a reduction in yield compared to that that was placed in the seed bed or split between the seed bed in a 2-way split or a little and often split. But it wasn't universal. We found that yield reduction occurred in 4 out of 11 sites, and it was associated with fewer grains per ear and hence grains per square meter. Grain nitrogen concentrations overall weren't significantly affected, but at 3 out of 11 sites, the grain nitrogen was actually higher with the later nitrogen treatment. But again, that's perhaps what we'd expect. But the uptake of nitrogen wasn't really affected. So the timing really didn't have much effect on the overall uptake efficiency. And again, we didn't find any difference between the 4 varieties that we were using. So the varieties didn't differ in their response to timing. So these data would suggest that clearly there are effects of timing, but there is some flexibility there in the timing, and that there may be relatively little scope for making, for trying to improve your nitrogen use efficiency through more precise timing. I think there's some flexibility here for in the way in which we time that nitrogen. So making more precise timings may not give us the benefits that we might be looking for. So the sort of final bit of work I want to cover are the experiments that we did looking at the efficiency of foliar and soil applied nitrogen. And this was what we did experiments here on spring barley, but also on winter wheat. So we had 1 side of spring barley, 2 sites of winter wheat, and we were looking at the effects of supplementing some of the basal soil applied nitrogen. This was applied as ammonium nitrate with foliar nitrogen, and the product we chose for this was Yara Vita Safe N300. So we're just looking at the one product in this particular year of the work. And what we did was to establish the full nitrogen response curve. So these are the treatments that we used for spring barley. So we had a range of plots going from 0 to 200 kilos of nitrogen per hectare with these splits. And then for these particular treatments highlighted in yellow, we also gave them some additional foliar nitrogen. And so we had 3 foliar nitrogen treatments. The controls had nothing. The F1 treatment was given 5 kilos of nitrogen per hectare at tillering, and then the F2 treatment was given 10 kilos with 5 at tillering and 5 at sort of growth stage 30. Now, what we've plotted here is the yield against the total nitrogen fertilizer rate, and what we see with the grey squares is the response to that soil applied nitrogen. So this is the observed response to the soil applied nitrogen. If with the foliar nitrogen we are getting a more effective, if it's 4 times more effective than the soil applied nitrogen, for every 10 kilos of foliar nitrogen, you'd expect to see the same response you'd get to adding 40 kilos of soil applied nitrogen. So these are the sort of the calculated, these red squares are the calculated expected response that we would get if it was 4 times more effective. But in fact, what we found was that these these foliar nitrogens, they sit right on top of the standard response curve. So they didn't seem to be any more effective than the soil applied nitrogen. So we don't have any evidence from these experiments, at least, that this particular product was more effective. Yes, they give us a small increase because of the additional nitrogen we've applied, but it's no more efficient than if we'd applied the same amount of nitrogen as ammonium nitrate to the soil. So in terms of key messages then, this work has shown no evidence that the new high yielding varieties need to be more need more nitrogen than the old varieties, and this is what was highlighted by Julian. They're more efficient. Current recommendations, I think, in LRB 209 are suggesting that it's over predicting crop nitrogen requirements. So this will be taken into consideration in the sort of new revisions of that. Nitrogen timing had relatively little effect on the efficiency of nitrogen uptake. Some nitrogen in the seed bed is clearly beneficial, and particularly in dry conditions. But if you put all the nitrogen into the seed bed, then there is a risk of nitrogen leaching. So I think operating through a 2-split or a 3-split system is probably going to give us the best overall efficiency. And we haven't found any evidence that foliar nitrogen applications are inherently more efficient, although we've only just looked at the one product. So the next stage of the work would be to do a comparison of different foliar end products. And I'd like to just end there by acknowledging other folk who were involved in this work. Some of it was done, the AHDB project was done in collaboration with ADAS, Pete Berry and Sarah Kendall. And then we have colleagues here at SRUC as well that were involved in both that work and the foliar nitrogen work.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ian. While we switch from Ian to George and George just gets his slides up, Ian, I'll ask you one question to kind of bridge the gap. Have you got any opinions? There's some wild claims in the media about the increased efficiency when using liquid application. Have you got any viewpoints on liquid versus granular?
Well, I think in terms of spreading, I think it may be more efficient. We haven't actually done any work on that ourselves, and I haven't actually seen a lot of independent sort of research data on that. I can't imagine, apart from the spreading and the better, the more uniform applications, why the liquid would be more efficient, unless you're operating under very dry conditions, of course. Because if the liquid is then actually penetrating into the soil and getting into the root zone, then that could increase efficiency. So it gets complicated when you're doing these comparisons, because it's likely to depend on the sort of the weather conditions that you do the trials under, isn't it?
Thank you very much, Ian. That's excellent. And we'll bring you back up at the end of George's to answer some more questions.
Thank you very much.
And George, if it's okay, I'll hand straight into you to talk to us about optimising the fertiliser use in this high cost year that we're experiencing. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Morning, everyone. We'll just go through my slides. We're going to look at optimising fertiliser in a high cost year. Undoubtedly, that's what it is. Okay. Sorry, apologise for that. Where are we? Well, I think this is what's facing everybody. Fertiliser prices have, completely rocketed through the past 12 months. If somebody sat here a year ago and said this was the trajectory that the prices were going to follow, you'd never have predicted it. Nitrogen effectively tripled in price, and your straights, potashes, phosphate doubled. So it's scary stuff, and it's something that growers are facing for the year ahead. Okay. What's the circumstances? There's several different reasons. Take your pick, one or two, or all of the above. gas supplies, gas prices. That was well publicised in the summer, how that was going to impact on nitrogen production. Geopolitical hotspots. You don't go far in the news nowadays before you come across the troubles in the Black Sea. That could impact in straits going forward, and it could also impact back to gas supplies. There's also been production issues elsewhere. You know, is this, it's a phrase that's been commonly used during the pandemic, new normal. Are we going to be looking at this sort of prices for a wee while? This is not just a one-off. Okay. If you take it down to farm level, it's this current year's crops that are the first set of crops, first harvest that's really going to take a brunt of this. So I just did a wee calculation. Crop of spring barley, it's getting 375 kilos a hectare of 616s, 300 weight an acre, and then 100 weight and a half to acre of nitrogen, 185 kilos per hectare, whichever way you prefer. 2021, that would have cost somewhere in the region of £175 a hectare. The year ahead, if it was bought, you know, in the autumn, back end, or, you know, fairly recently, £375 a hectare, £200 a hectare more, so more than doubled. In terms of your production cost of production per tonne of grain, that's got huge implications. Some of the more marginal areas or marginal fields, it's going to hike up cost of production of grain by £40 a tonne. Now, higher yielding areas, not so much, but it's still, you know, even producers that were getting 8 tonnes a hectare to just over 3 tonnes an acre is still adding £25 a tonne onto the production cost. That's not including extra fuel costs, and machineries are all going up in price, so there's extra costs coming from elsewhere as well. That's just the fertiliser increase. So this year, crops are going to be much more expensive to grow. Okay. What can we do about it? Well, we can try and get everything else right. Do we know what we need and only apply what we actually need? That might help. What other sources are available? So mucks, slurries, digestates, composts. Some of the latter seem to be becoming more and more available, but that is area dependent. Can we use it better? So maybe comes a bit more to getting everything else right, so improving your efficiency, and harks back a wee bit to what Ian was covering. Cut back and use less. That is that is an option this year. Maybe also ties in with number 2, knowing exactly what you need, only applying what you actually need. Not do anything. You just close your eyes and carry on. Then for some people, they might just choose to try and ride it out. It's not really the year to try and maximise yield at all costs. Focus on your margin. Try and get this margin. I think that's really the key point this year. Chasing yield, it could be an expensive hobby this year. Okay. Getting the basics right. Okay, this is a message. It's probably gone out lots and lots of times in the past, but the way the prices have gone now with the fertiliser, it's probably never been so important. Start with your pH. How do you measure your pH? Obviously, soil analysis. Make sure it's up to date. Great, last 3, 4, 5 years, you should be fine. However, if it's longer than that, perhaps you need to think about it. Now, a lot of people will be GPS sampling on a cycle for 4 years, what have you. Others will still be going the more old-fashioned way of sampling. Just make sure everything's up to date. Has something been missed? Has a few fields been missed out? Have you fallen out of your routine? Worth checking. Sampling is relatively cheap. Now, obviously, GPS is a bit more expensive, but if you're looking at the soil auger and your bucket, mixing it up in a sample per field, it's about £20, give or take, and that covers your pH, your phosphate, potash, magnesium, and of course, more recently, soil organic matter. So that's not expensive if you divide it up per acre, and it will do you for several years. Scotland soils are naturally acidic, so your pH should creep down over the years, certainly if you're using fertilisers. One wee caveat in here, that if you do a sample and it comes back that you actually need more than 5-6 tons of lime, it's advised that you split the application. It just allows it to go better through the profile. What you don't want is applying a big application of lime, and it ends up causing problems with the pH in the soil. Nutrient lockup, which is counterproductive to what you are trying to achieve, really. Just why is pH important? Which is next slide. I think this slide was shown earlier in the week, but it's just as relevant for this. As you can see with the white bars, that's where you're measuring your nutrient availability. So if you are, above 6, obviously you are ideally between 6 and 6.5. You're getting the best of both worlds there. You are getting as much nutrients as you can. Okay, next slide. When you're doing your soil analysis, that is also the starting point for considering how much potash and phosphate to use. Have we saying there, if you don't know what you have, how do you know what you need? And that is very, very true. Phosphate and potash, very, very important to crop growth. You don't really need me to tell you that's a list of some of the key areas that these elements are involved in. Okay, next slide. How much P&K does a crop need? Well, if you're matching offtake with expected yield or anticipated yield, and you take your soil, you need to take into account soil analysis, PSC, which I'll come to later, and also farmyard manure. But in terms of pure offtake, I've listed 3 crops here. So there's spring barley, spring oats, and winter wheat. As you can see, as the yields start to creep up, the phosphate requirement also creeps up, but the potash requirement most definitely really does ramp up. Once you're above even 3 tons an acre, that's quite a potash requirement in the crops. Certainly, if you're growing spring oats, for instance, and you're getting good yields, and some people are getting decent yields of spring oats, it's taking a lot of nutrients out of the land. So well worth bearing in mind when you're planning your applications. Okay, next slide. Making adjustments to your recommendation. What is soil P absorption capacity? All soils, when you apply phosphate, some soils will bind with the applied phosphate different than others, essentially making some of this phosphate less available than other soils. So these recommendations need just tweaked slightly to take that into account. There is a series of technical notes covering this in Scotland. That technical note 715 to 718, that's for the map of Scotland's been divided into 4. So all Scotland should be covered. I think if you're unsure which soil association you are in, most farmers know, but in case it's outlying land you're taking on temporarily, there is a wee website there you can go on to. You can find just that soil association. It's very handy. The table at the bottom shows the adjustments for the different PSCs. The soils are banded 1, 2, 3. As you can see, there is a bit of variation there. PSC 3, for instance, if your analysis comes back as moderate minus or M minus, actually in the past that might have been fine, but the latest, using the latest technical notes, it's actually suggesting that you need to adjust that recommendation by adding in an extra 20 kilos per hectare of phosphate. But something to bear in mind, worth looking at. Certainly when we go back to the offtakes from your anticipated yield. Okay, adjustments for potash, much simpler. For some reason I've included the potatoes in there, but if you look at the middle line in that table, it's a lot more simpler. If it comes back moderate, then fine. If it's high, you have the opportunity to reduce your recommendation by half, effectively. And at the same token, if it comes back low, you have to step it up. So that's pretty straightforward there. Okay. In terms of recommendations, I thought again I'll do a wee calculation. A farmer is expecting 7 tonnes a hectare of spring barley. In terms of offtake, that is 59.5 kilos a hectare of phosphate, 84 kilos a hectare of potash. So that's matching his offtake, which is fine. They do a soil analysis. It comes back as moderate plus for phosphate, high for potash, and he works out that he is his band in his PSC2, with soil association. So he does his calculation. That allows him to reduce his phosphate by 20 kilos, and he can also have his recommendation for the potash. So that takes him down to 39.5 kilos a hectare of phosphate, 42 kilos of potash. So what's that in terms of savings? Well, I've just gone with £1.15 a kilo for the phosphate and 92 pence a kilo for the potash. It's going to be that's going to vary. I dare say this year, but that's a saving of £45 in terms of phosphate and £38 in terms of potash. So £84 basically, just by doing the soil analysis and being a bit more accurate, being more bespoke with a recommendation. We do a lot of records for people, and we do know that there's quite a lot of people that it's a blanket application. It goes on, it's 200 weights of this, 300 weights of that, everything gets 300 weights of that. So this shows the benefit of maybe just taking a wee bit more time and making recommendations just a bit more bespoke to each field. Just a wee caveat again at the bottom there, where indices are low, it may suggest that you need to put on a bit more, but these applications will be much more responsive, so you will get the reward. It might be, with the price of fertiliser this year, it might be tempting to try and cut back. If it's needed, it's needed at the end of the day. But where your indices are low, you will get the benefit from the applications. Okay, next slide, please. Nitrogen, a question we have been asked quite a lot over the winter. Should I cut back? As we mentioned earlier, nitrogen has tripled really in the last 12 months. Nitrogen recommendations are based on how much nitrogen is required to give us economic optimum yield. So that's fine. And nitrogen, it's a key driver. It's vital for growth, vital for yield, and also crop quality. You can't ignore that. Key things to remember. Nitrogen response, it's not linear. There is a lot of diminishing returns. I'm sure that is familiar to a lot of people. The curves are familiar to a lot of people. And the most yield comes from that, generally that first 100, 120 kilos of nitrogen. And then it starts tailing off. Not all yield, remember, comes from the bag. That's important to remember, that there will be nitrogen coming from the soil. There could be nitrogen coming from applied manures, or even just residual fertility, depending on what the crop was before. Okay, next one. This is what I was mentioning slightly earlier, a nitrogen response curve. It's not for any crop, and specifically, it just is an example of the nitrogen response curve. So there we see A, that is the nitrogen that's coming up from the soil. If we look at C, that is the maximum yield. B is that point where it's you're getting the economic return. That is the break-even ratio, effectively. The bit between A to B, that's where you apply nitrogen and you're making a profit basically by doing so. The bit between B and C, you are applying more and more nitrogen. Yes, you're getting more yield, but you're spending more. You're spending more money to get this extra yield. It's no longer, it's a negative margin basically. You're spending more money than you're getting back. This year, that point B, because we're seeing the price of fertiliser go up relative to the grain price, that B is coming back further down the line. So the red line is going back down to the green, effectively. Next slide, please. Where is B? Well, a brief explanation is the break-even ratio is the kilos of grain that you need to cover the cost of 1 kilo of nitrogen. Scotland, our recommendations have been based at 3:1. So basically that, in layman's terms, that is apply nitrogen until the response is all you're getting back is 3 kilos of nitrogen from 1 kilo of grain. After that point, you stop. That's it. It's no longer economically viable to do so. Oilseeds a bit different, 2.5:1. In England, in RB209, it's slightly different figures again. 5:1 for cereals, 2.5:1 for oilseed rape. So they're the same for oilseed rape. Break-even ratio is a function of the fertiliser price relative to the expected grain price. We'll do the calculations just in a wee moment. Well, grain price is fertiliser prices are at historical prices. Grain prices are also the same. There are some, well, we've seen some good contracts out there recently for the harvest ahead. Futures have been either back a bit from where they were, but thankfully, grain prices are also high. However, what does that do to the overall ratio? And from work that's been done, there are adjustments that can be made to the recommended rates based on this ratio. Just before we go a wee bit further, the nitrogen response curve is steeper for spring crops, so the adjustments for them are slightly smaller. Okay, how do you calculate a break-even ratio? Well, you need to calculate the price in pence of a kilo of nitrogen. So that is taking the cost of the nitrogen in the bag per tonne divided by the kilos. And then you also need the price per kilo of grain or seed. Everybody's break-even ratio will be different. depends on the price you've paid for your fertiliser. It also depends on what your anticipated grain price is. For some, they will be targeting a feed grain market. Others will be targeting more premium markets, malting, barley, mill and wheat, maybe less so in Scotland. So you've got to kind of, realise where, what you're growing for. Okay, and the next slide, please. As I said earlier, everybody's BER will be different this year. There will be farmers who are in the way of buying nitrogen early. They buy it June. They will have gone out. They'll have covered themselves there. They will be feeling mightily relieved, I am sure, that they did so. You have other farmers. Their approach is they take some cover in June, July time. They buy some nitrogen. Then they've got some. If the price goes up, so be it. They're covered. If the price comes down, yeah, so be it. They'll take advantage of the cheaper nitrogen later on. So that's farmers B in the B column. C, you have other farmers who will wait, and this year there were people who were quite prepared to sit and wait it out and see how the prices developed, and in the hope that it would come back a bit. So you've got a huge range of fertiliser prices being applied this year. Crop sale, I've put in the same crop price. I have gone for £220. That is a malt and barley price. The reality is, who knows with the price, but I think that is maybe a reasonable stab for some of the prices it's been going about. So if you work it back to the pence per kilo of nitrogen, for farmer A, that's 87 pence, farmer B, 145, farmer C up at 188. So huge range there in terms of nitrogen price. Pence, the price per kilo of grain is 22 pence across the board. When you do that sum, the price divided by the kilo of grain, we've got a break-even ratio of 3.95 for farmer A, 6.6 for farmer B, 8.5 for farmer C. So again, massive variation. On to the next slide, please. This is the adjustment to recommended rates according to your break-even ratio. Your BER, so I think in the last slide we had somebody, it would have been between 3.5 and 4.5, suggesting that in spring crops you could pull it back by 8 kilos. I think somebody put 6.6, so pulling it back 32, and the final, the farmer who had bought more expensively, suggesting he pulls it back by 40 kilos. That sounds a lot. However, I think if we move on to the next slide, these calculations are based on yield. Quality is a big consideration. And the reality is you need to know where you are relative to the recommended rates. And that can be dependent on the site, dependent on your yield expectations. It can be, and also quality. You've got to take those into account before you start amending your rates. There will be scope for some to cut back. There's no doubt about that. I've wrestled with it when I first looked at this. It is difficult to get your head around. Years and years it's been get yield, chase yield, chase yield, chase yield. My suggestion is, if you're not happy really embracing it, try some tramline trials at different rates. If you've got the capability to use a yield monitor or assess it, try different rates just to see the difference. It's worth trying. Like I said, suspect this circumstance of this. Yeah, fertiliser could come back a bit, but so could the grain price. So the BER could remain quite similar. So it's worth having a look and just seeing if you can trim it back a wee bit. For malt and barley growers, there might not be much need to change your rates at all. you could already be applying at a reduced rate from recommendation. For many, the standard nitrogen rate for growing spring barley is 130 kilos a hectare. If it's on a sandy soil, that's 150 kilos. So if you work it back from there, quite a lot of those growers will be applying 110, 120 kilos for the molten barley. They're already 30 kilos back from the recommended level. So probably don't need to do too much. But again, it depends where you sit. Everybody's different. The other side of the coin is, even if you have been paying a big price for your nitrogen, if you're targeting a milling contract, a biscuit wheat contracts, I'm pretty sure they still need the proteins kept up, or having high nitrogen malted barley, you've got to secure that premium. You've got to make sure you get your nitrogen content in there. So you need to concentrate on your timings and you've got to secure that premium really. So that needs a lot of thought. Nitrogen efficiency varies year to year, site to site. There's no doubt about that. You can apply the same rate 2 years in a row. You won't get the same yield. It's not just the nitrogen that affects the yield, the weather, undoubtedly. If you pulled it back 10 kilos a hectare and your yield dropped half a tonne an acre, it's not the fact that you've deducted 10 kilos a hectare. The weather is impacting there. So it's not just nitrogen that is driving the yield. There's other factors. Important to look at the potential of your crop and base your decision accordingly. Work with your agronomist in this. It's a difficult decision. It's going to be kind of almost a change in mindset for a lot of people. Don't be afraid to take out areas that are not looking great. You can't get a silk purse from a sow's ear in some cases. Barley in particular, tillers aren't there, the plants aren't there. Be realistic with yourself. Is the yield likely to be there? Why low? It's maybe not a case of throwing on all the nitrogen and trying to salvage it. It's maybe not going to be salvageable. You maybe just have to let it take its course. It's a difficult one to get your head around. I appreciate that. But you need keep an eye on your market. Certainly, if you are targeting higher value markets, you've got to be wary of that and make sure you get your premiums there. Okay, next slide. I've tried to do in 5 minutes where there's been meetings that have been an hour and a half on. So what I'm suggesting to people is to find out a bit more detail and with a bit more of the response curves. There was a webinar done before Christmas. Feel free to download it and see what you think from it. Basically, it is, like I said, I've wrestled with it, but I can see the curves and I can see the sums as well. But after years and years of being encouraged to go for yield, it feeds back to what Julian's saying. It's getting the most efficient. It's a combination of getting the most efficiency, but also keeping an eye on the margin as well. Okay. Farming urban use, I think Julian touched on this earlier. Farming urban use, I'm going to broaden that. Is it digestate? Is it compost? For some, this is an option. It may not be an option for some people. There's no doubt about that. Some people have their own mucks and slurries. People have their muck for straw. It's quite common in our area. There is increasingly more digestates becoming available. A lot more AD plants They seem to be springing up around the country. Compost, we're in an area where there is plenty of compost, but again, that is area specific. Worth finding out what's available and where. However, location's important. These sort of manures, and particularly low dry matter slurries, they have a transport cost. So that has to be factored in. And importantly, many of these have a cost as well, or can have a cost. Some of them are waste, or as good as waste, they're byproducts. So in some cases, they're not that expensive. It's horses for courses, really. And I think it's a case of asking the question. One thing to add in, there can be huge variations in these type of products. Even farmyard manures, it really, it can be different. There can be a big variation. If you're getting farmyard manure from somebody that's feeding dry cows and straw-based diet, that's going to be very different from a farmyard manure that is coming from somebody that is maybe hard feeding livestock, hard feeding cattle. So it is worth getting a test just to see what you have got in terms of nitrogen, phosphate and potash, because that can make a difference in terms of how you interpret that in your recommendations in your fertiliser plan. It's worth also mentioning that the availability of nutrients also vary throughout the year, and also method of application, in particular with slurries, whether it's ploughed in or onto the growing crop. A lot more people now are applying slurries onto the growing crop, and it really seems to work. Whether you apply in the winter or the spring, back to the slurry, whether it's a splash plate or you're injecting in, there are, again, it goes back to efficiencies. You're getting more out of that product. Okay. Next slide. I've just put up a list of livestock manures with our different nutrients. I haven't put up the ones for digestates and that, but again, there's a range of technical notes on these. It's not difficult to find out what's in them or what the standard values are. As I said, it is at times best to take a test. These are just the standard values after all. As you can see, within that there is also sulfur. It's a useful source of sulfur in some of these products. Magnesium as well, and there's other things as well. In some areas, I know round about the turf area, there can be, we're on a sandstone base, there can be an issue with copper deficiency. Pig muck seems to have solved that for many farmers, and there is a good level of copper in pig muck. So it can also solve other issues. It's a useful soil conditioner as well. Okay. I thought we'd just do a work through again. This farmer, he's got access to his own cattle manure, a cattle muck, wants to use it to reduce his fertiliser application as much as possible. So basically, do a fertiliser plan. He's growing spring barley. He's in an MVZ. It's classed as an OMS soil, organic mineral soil. He's not applying any yield adjustments. His expected yield, he's expecting it to be 7 tonnes a hectare. That's his average yield been for the last few years, so that's fair enough. He's been good. He's gone and got his soil tested. He is testing at an M- for P and K, and he has looked up the website, or he's asked his advisor and found out he is a PSC2. So effectively, there is no adjustment required for his phosphate recommendation here. What's crop recommendation? Well, in terms of nitrogen, 130 kilos a hectare. Phosphate, back that 59.5 kilos a hectare. Potash, 84.84 kilos a hectare. He will be putting at least 25 kilos a hectare of phosphate downspout. That is really just an insurance. If you get a cold spring, phosphate is not particularly mobile. It just makes sure there's some near the seed. Okay, next scenario. Okay, looking at the table here, there's quite a lot of detail on there, but we'll just take a wee minute to work it through. As you can see, that is just his standard fertiliser application. He is, normally he would apply 375 kilos of 16s. So doing that, even he's not maybe quite putting on enough K. And then he would follow that up, top dress, with 200 kilos of a hectare of nitrogen. So that just takes him under the NVZ limit. And that comes to this year, £373.75, £373.75 per hectare. If he factors in the cattle muck, what difference does it make? Well, at 20 tonnes a hectare, which is not a massive application, and it's been muck that's been sitting in a midden, that would give him 12 kilos of nitrogen, 64 kilos of phosphate, and 160 kilos of potash. In terms of a nutrient value, using the values from earlier, I think it was £101.88 for the, or 188 pence for the nitrogen, 115 for the P, and 92 pence for the K. That's what that equates to. The £22.56 of nitrogen, 73.60 of phosphate, and £147.20 of potash. When he takes that into account, what fertiliser does he actually need? Well, doesn't need any more potash, that's for sure. Well over what he needs. He's still wanting to put on his 25 kilos of phosphate downspout. So although he technically doesn't need it, he's still going to do it just to make sure that the plant get it up and away. And he still pretty much needs, there's a small reduction in his nitrogen requirement. So the fertiliser required now is £250.59. So that's a saving of £123.16 a hectare. That's pretty good. Alternatively, he might go with 10 tonnes a hectare for cattle muck, which again doesn't sound a lot. In fact, that's quite a small application. It's not giving him as much nitrogen, and clearly, obviously, it's half the level of P, half the level of K. In terms of values, again, £11.23 of nitrogen, 36.80 of phosphate, 73.60 of potash. What does he still require to put on? Well, yeah, he needs slightly more nitrogen. He's almost applying half he's applying slightly more than half his phosphate, but he was going to be putting on some anyway, so that's no big deal there. And he requires a wee bit of potash, but not much. Whether he would be inclined to put some on or not, I don't know. However, in terms of that, comes to 268.43, what his fertiliser requirement would be. So that would just be a saving of £105.32. However, the next slide, is little and often best. Well, if we're assuming the midden is 500 tonnes, which is a decent sized midden, to be fair, at 20 tonnes a hectare, his range is 25 hectares. So that's given a total benefit of £3,079. 10 tonnes a hectare, however, £105.32 of a benefit per hectare, that's 5,266. So that is, yeah, that's over £2,000 better off just by making it go a bit further. The extra nutrients that are being applied, because they're not being wasted, they're helping build reserves. But in a short-term view, they're not helping reduce this current year's bills. You need to think of logistics, time and pounds. If your land is spread out, then this is maybe not really valid. If you're quite contained, then it's perhaps worth thinking about. Spring crops, again, comes back to this. They should still get some peat in the spout just to get them up and away. And it's worth targeting your farmyard manures at soils with the lowest indices for the most benefit. You know, again, these come, you know, a lot of these products come with a cost. So that has to be factored in as well. However, obviously, if it's your own manure, it's a different calculation you have to do. Okay.
Sorry to interrupt, George. We're going to have to push on a bit as well. We're running a bit over.
Okay, I'll crack on. Don't forget about sulphur. Some growers, you'll end up with different fertilisers than what you normally use. So just make sure you've still got a bit of sulphur there. Sulphur is a key role in nutrient efficiency. As you can see there, oilseed rapeseed, 75 kilos a hectare of sulphur it's required. Cereals, not quite so much, but still need some. So worth looking at what the products you're receiving this year. Make sure you're getting sulphur to them. Otherwise, you may need to add some through the sprayer. Sulphur, remember, is deficient in most soils, especially after wet winters. Although, as we've just seen, farmyard manures can help address that in part. Okay, next slide. Just briefly go through machinery. Know your settings for each type of fertiliser. As I said earlier, you could be looking at different types of grades this year, different types. If it looks the same, doesn't necessarily mean it is. So just know your settings for each type so that there's no stripes, no nasty mistakes. Uneven spreading, it affects your yield, affects your quality. You're not fulfilling potential, but you could end up with some lodging and strips. Again, if you're handling different stuff, something to be wary of. Keeping your fertiliser spreader in good order is important. Do regular tray tests. 500-acre cereal farm could be spreading £80,000 worth of fertiliser this year. A few percent out, then that more than justifies just running it over the tray test a couple of times, just to make sure it's in order. And even something like veins and discs, make sure they're in good order and perhaps not just, you know, for excessive wear and tear, perhaps worth replacing. Only apply your nitrogen when conditions are right, so ideally reasonably calm. Soil temperatures are starting to rise. Resist the temptation when the NVZ calendar allows you to put on. You'll get far better utilisation when that crop is growing. I know time can be a big, you know, you've got the feeling can be there to get it on, but think about getting the best out of that fertiliser. Avoid spreading when heavy rain is forecast. It can wash away your nitrogen and more importantly, it washes away your money. Potentially look at splits, although that adds another cost, £4 an acre or £10 a hectare every time you run over. Whether it improves efficiency, I'm not sure about, but perhaps leads to less losses from heavy rain and such like. Reduces the likelihood of losses. Try not to spread stressed crops. Sometimes it's not easy if time's against you. There'll be far better utilisation when they're healthy. And also think about trace elements. It's not really the year to scrimp on them, manganese, etc. And just because you see a deficiency, you don't see a deficiency, doesn't mean it's not there. And if you're in any doubt, test. Okay, next slide. Compaction's a hidden killer. You know, try to avoid it. It's costly to alleviate, and really only work your land when it's fit, not just by the calendar. Again, time. You know, you can feel that you've got to get over the land and such like, but you could be creating bigger problems further down the line. You know, if you work it when it's fit, it's giving you that best opportunity to get a good seed bed and better nutrient utilisation, basically. You know, it comes back to this having a good structure. If you're unsure, get out your spade, do a vest test. Okay, next slide. Longer term, something to think about. Straw incorporation, is that something that's going to be something to be thinking about? Cover crops becoming more and more popular, although again there's a cost there, but if the net benefit is better, then it's something to think about, particularly if you can graze them off. Grow crops that need less nitrogen, so potentially oats, if you can get the market for them, or even to start thinking about growing legumes to reduce the nitrogen for following crops. Okay, I think that's me there. Take home messages, sort out your basics, know exactly what your requirements are. So basically you're not applying stuff you don't need. Can you get alternative sources? Be realistic with your yields. Why, don't try and feed for a 10-hectare crop just an expectation. If realistically you're only going to get a 7.5 tonne a hectare crop. Make sure you apply things correctly. Address any limiting factors if you can. Try to save costs is great, but if a crop needs something, then it needs it, because it can affect the utilization of other nutrients. And focus on your margin, not outright yield. Okay.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, George. And sorry to interrupt you there at the end.
Apologise for going over. Yeah,
that's all right. It's all brilliant stuff, and I'm reluctant to ever do that, but I'm just conscious of the next two speakers. Thank you very much. And there's so many brilliant take-home messages for the season there. We've had a few questions come in. I think I'm going to save them for the panel session at the end so we can get through everybody first. And thank you very much. I think, Henry, I'll swiftly go straight into you there. And we're going to be talking about IPM and kind of measuring IPM and how you can use that to kind of inform your decisions on farm. So if you're happy, Henry, I'll hand the virtual stage over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Richard. Yeah, so today I'm going to talk to you about measuring IPM and how we can use that to inform future decision making. So this is the IPM process, and starts with prevention measures. What can you do to prevent the introduction and spread of pests on farm? And then we can look at the adoption measures. Oh, apologies, can you see me, Richard?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah, so after the prevention, we look at detection, so monitoring and surveillance throughout the season, and then consider what interventions are needed, maybe non-chemical or chemical. Typically, we're looking at a pesticide. And then finally, it's crucially important step is that evaluation stage, and what worked, what didn't, how can we use that to inform future decision making. So to facilitate that process, we've developed these IPM assessment plans, which are available on the Plant Health Centre website, and if you're in England, the NFU website. It's a short tool. The plan only takes about 20 minutes to complete, and the idea is that it's through completing the plan and writing down what you're doing now and looking at the potential options you could introduce in the farm in the future. You can sit down with the main decision makers, typically the farmer and their agronomist, and come up with an action plan that will be specific to the farm, the crop, the field, or the specific pest-weed combination. So it's taking that sort of higher level assessment and turn it into something that's tangible and can put into effect on farm. There's a metric that sits behind the IPM plan that gives farmers an overall score out of 100. This was developed by expert opinion over the arable one. There was over 50 agronomists and farmers and researchers that contributed towards it. This is also useful in that it allows us to identify potential issues or topics requiring further research or knowledge transfer and exchange activities. This year, we've collected over 5,000 IPM plans. The majority of those are arable, and this is the distribution in terms of IPM score. As you can see, we've got quite a normal distribution, indicating that we should be capturing a good range and a representative range in terms of the overall IPM adoption on arable farms. And we also have the same for grassland. As you'll see, there's far fewer grassland plans submitted, indicating that we perhaps need to engage more with the grassland sector when discussing IPM. A few farmers I'd speak to, and they're predominantly livestock, can potentially regard IPM as more of an arable horticultural thing, but it's still crucially important in grasslands, specifically we're talking about weed management. We can start to look at the differences in IPM score. So first, this is a national differences. As you'll see, there's quite low number of observations in Northern Ireland and Wales, so huge pinch of salt taken with interpreting any of their results. But from this chart, you can see that those in England are performing significantly better than farmers in Scotland as assessed by this IPM metric. Obviously, there's a lot of variation around that, and actually the total difference in the IPM score is only about 10, but it's still a significantly different difference. So we'll look to see what actually led to those differences. There's a question in the plan that asks about rotation, so specifically about continuous cereals. And I appreciate that the colours are not ideal on this chart, but if you look at the none bars, so no amount of land in continuous cereals on the right, and England is the first bar on the left, the darker one, and Scotland is the second in from the right. And what you'll notice there's far fewer farmers in Scotland practicing no continuous cereals at all. And actually a good chunk of those farmers have up to a quarter of their land under continuous cereals. There could be various reasons for this. The environmental conditions make more crops more suitably grown in England than in Scotland. And certainly if you go into the north of Scotland, fewer crops are suitable to those environmental conditions, which could reduce the ability to rotate crops and have that extended, more diverse rotations that can be grown successfully in England. There's also market issues as well. In Scotland, there's a high dominance of the spring malting barley market, which perhaps is encouraging some growers to grow continuous barley in those areas of the farm on lighter land where they're able to achieve the specs for malting barley, for example. Some of the other differences we can observe from these plans are differences in soil cultivation. So as you'll see from the purple bar in the centre of the chart, those farmers in Scotland are still very much operating under a ploughed system, whether that be rotational or regular ploughing, which is over the majority are using a regular ploughing system. Compared to in England, where the majority are using reduced or no-till systems. Again, thinking about the types of farming, if you go down the reduced till, no-till route, typically you're introducing more crops into rotation, you're lengthening that rotation, you've got more diversity within the cash crops, but also potentially introducing cover crops and things like that as well. So it's a technological trajectory that people go on once they decide to leave the plough in the shed, which influences lots of other things related to IPM, soil management as well. And the environmental and agronomic factors interact, and they affect which problem pests are the top priority in each of the countries. And perhaps no surprise there to see that in England, the blackgrass is dominating in terms of the top pests, whereas it's much less of an issue in Scotland and Northern Ireland, where there's far fewer min-till, no-till practices adopted. Talking about the environmental effects, you'll see that as you move further north, Scotland, Northern Ireland, even Wales, slugs are considered a top priority, and in fact they are across all of the countries. Other factors, more wild oat issues cited in Scotland because more oats are being grown there, so it's more an issue. Right, so related to that, as we've seen there's more of a tendency to go down the min-till, no-till route in England and Wales. That's led to particular pest problems such as blackgrass, other grass weeds as well, which in turn has led to the introduction of techniques to stay on top of those pest issues. So if you look to the right of the graph, the stale seed beds are practiced quite extensively in England and Wales, where there's, according to this sample, they're not at all in Scotland and Northern Ireland. And that's partly to remedy the blackgrass problem, or take steps to doing so, but also the environmental conditions allow for this practice to be more consistently adopted in England and Wales, where you have a larger time between harvesting one crop and sowing the next crop. So there are other constraints that are placed on the grower in terms of the environment, the agronomics, and the markets that are sort of driving that decision process as well. There's various other things I can talk about around preventative measures, but I haven't got time to go into them today. One other thing that did crop up across all of the types of pests, diseases, weeds, invertebrate pests is the role of crop inspections and frequent crop inspections being particularly widely sort of conserved across the board, which is useful and reassuring to see. Also, there is a tendency to very much avoid the use of broad spectrum insecticides in England and Wales. Again, thinking about the types of system, there's perhaps more biodiversity on farms that have gone down that reduced tillage or no tillage, more diverse cropping rotation route. There may be more investment, and because of the diversity in the farm, on encouraging natural predation and things like that, so perhaps less of a requirement for broad spectrum insecticides. So that was looking at some of the national differences. We can also look at some of the differences between sectors as well. So this question asked about the factors influencing the adjustment of spray programs throughout a year. As you'll see, if you go down the bottom, third one up, is perhaps not surprising, and also reassuring to see that the high influence placed on the advice from basis qualified agronomists. The next step down, looking at weather conditions at the top, also deemed very important, as is the observed levels of pests in the field. So scouting crops, very important here. And it's crucial that the decisions are based on that, particularly when thresholds are considered. Moving further down, growth stage of the crop also seems very important. Resistant management coming into things, and the crop economic potentials we've sort of discussed earlier today can affect the decision to spray, as well as looking at a field and deciding whether or not to give it that extra bit of nitrogen. It may not be worth saving, and that the same can be true of crop protection, but you must be aware of the fact that potentially if a particular type of pest, particularly talking about weeds, is not controlled, that can lead to problems later down the line in years to come. And it's kind of reassuring to see that not many growers are basing their decision to adjust spray programs based on calendar date and the advice from farmers in the area, so that people are independently making their own decisions rather than just going along with what their neighbours are doing. And when we look at grasslands, we see a similar story. Weather conditions and forecasts are the top influencer, and then we're looking at things like growth stage of the weed and observed levels of the weed in the field. Grassland was focused solely on weed management and grassland plan. There's perhaps less of an influence of the advisor recommendation when it comes to IPM on farm, and it could be that those advisors are more brought onto the farm to deal with the livestock part of the business, and there's perhaps little or less discussion of the actual crop and protecting that. So what are those higher adopters doing that the lower adopters aren't? So when we looked at the top 25% of farmers and compared it to the bottom 25% as assessed by the IPM metric, we can look at what they're doing and compared to the others. So the red line is the maximum achievable in the metric for that particular question. And you'll see that there's many more preventative measures adopted by those top 25% of growers, and also many more factors considered when planning and reviewing and developing future IPM plans. This is really important because IPM is a holistic process that aims to maximize productivity and profitability whilst minimizing the negative impacts on the environment. So the more factors considered when planning for IPM, field history, technical efficacy of the products, crop sequence, cost benefit analysis, and then generally speaking, the greater level of IPM that's going to be adopted, because you measuring more things and using them to inform your decision making going forward. We're looking at the grassland sector. Similarly to the arable, those top growers are adopting many more preventative measures, considering more things when planning for IPM, developing and evaluating those plans. But one thing that did strike me when I was looking at these results is that the maximum that can be awarded for planning factors is not being achieved by those top farmers. So it indicates that actually the experts think there's could be more done by those top growers in terms of improving IPM adoption overall. So what can we change? What can't we change? There are some things that can be quite difficult to change. So the size of the farm, for example, is kind of to a certain degree out of our hands. But we did see some quite interesting things when looking at our area and how that affected IPM score. This is a logarithmic scale, and you can see there's a very strong, statistically significant relationship between the amount of arable land and IPM score. There could be various reasons for it. Larger businesses could have more capacity to rotate crops. They've got more fields, more soil types, allowing them to practice longer rotations. They potentially got more opportunity and ability to buy machinery or labour costs to implement further IPM practices. And also they may be more willing to buy in IPM advice either through an independent agronomist or even potentially have an in-house agronomist, which should serve to improve IPM score. We did not see this relationship when we looked at the influence of grassland area on IPM score, and that was seen whether we looked at the different types of grassland or grassland overall, indicating that if you increase the size of a livestock farm, there's no increase in IPM uptake. So that's something we can't really change very easily, but it's kind of well known that to integrate a new practice, you first must educate yourself on that practice. Makes sense. And the same is true of IPM. We asked the growers how familiar they are with IPM practice, and this was self-assessed on 1 to 5 scale, from not at all familiar to very familiar. And we can see that there's a strong relationship, significant relationship between how familiar they deem themselves to be and their IPM score. And there's obviously a lot of variation here. Just because you've got knowledge of the practice doesn't necessarily mean you're going to implement it, and there may be various economic, technological, behavioural barriers to further IPM uptake. But generally, something we can affect, and something we consistently see as having a positive effect on IPM is that engagement in IPM education. And on that note, when asked about their preferred information sources, we find that the top IPM adopters prefer information coming from research organisations that's put through levy boards and membership organisations. And this is independent research. It's all going to be evidence-based. There's no agenda there, as there can be, because there's a lot of IPM advice out on the internet, and some people may be looking to push a certain product, and we just need to be wary of that sort of misinformation that has not been independently verified that can be out there. The top growers are also evaluating previous control strategies more and using that to inform future decision making. And there seems to be a slight preference for an independent agronomist over a distributor agronomist for the higher adopters as well. Right down the other end, we've got farming press. So those that rely more on farming press as a top source of IPM advice are typically scoring lower. And this is because farming press can be useful, but it's a passive way of receiving information. There's not that exchange, that active exchange of information, which is really useful in terms of IPM uptake. We asked her about their relationship with their agronomist, and about half of the sample said they rely solely on their agronomist for all the crop management, crop protection decisions, whereas the other half worked with their agronomist to make those decisions together, and less than 1% didn't use an agronomist. So just highlights this really significant and important role that agronomists have in terms of translating that research that comes from higher up, sort of guidance from research organisations, and making that into an actionable IPM plan that can lead to change on farm. So just to summarise a bit on IPM plans, this tool is useful in assessing overall IPM strategy. You get a score in which you can sort of benchmark against yourself and hopefully take steps to try to improve upon your IPM score. And the higher adopters adopt more preventative measures. They consider many more factors when developing and evaluating IPM plans. Again, this is an iterative process of constant evaluation and improvement. And those top adopters are actively seeking IPM knowledge. It's up to us to make sure that the messages put out are clear, consistent, and evidence-based. And we'll be continually developing these sector-specific plans. So we've got the arable one and the grassland one up and running on the NFU and Plant Health Centre websites. And hopefully next month we should launch the specialist horticulture IPM plan too. So that's what we can do in terms of measuring our overall strategy and approach to RPM at a farmer or farm level. But we need to be looking at different scales because IPM works at the landscape, the farm, the field, the crop, or even the specific crop pest situation level. And to try to help with that sort of lower end of the scale, we've been working with ADAS and the NFU in a project funded by DEFRA. It's a test and trial project, so they're looking at ways to develop these the sustainable farming incentive scheme, and this one obviously focuses on IPM. So at the moment there's Excel files for wheat, potatoes and grassland. The farmer can go in and note which of the particular types of pests are more or less of an issue on the farm, as seen by the colours at the top of the chart, yellow, orange, green. And then they can be guided through to the effective control measures as indicated by the question marks in the cells, with the control measures down the left-hand side. They can click on the control and state whether that practice is in use or not in use, or if there are plans to introduce it in the short term or the long term as well. So as well as recording what's going on now, there's that commitment to change, and there's also links to relevant guidance as well that are within this tool. And this is what's sort of sitting behind the tool. There's a review that was done by ADAS last year on the effectiveness of different control measures to stay on top of particular pests. As well as evaluating effectiveness, there was also other things scored: potential use, current use. So if there's a low current use and a high potential use, it could be that there's a knowledge transfer barrier there. We need to be communicating the benefits of that particular practice better. Or if the strength of evidence perhaps isn't there, we maybe need to be focusing on more R&D in that area, particularly if it's got a high potential for economic importance, for example. We're in a project again with ADAS that is conducting another IPM review for other crops. So that will inform future land management plans, those Excel files. So these, as I said before, these are evidence-based. It takes a couple of hours to complete, and they'll probably be launched along with an instructional video and some written notes as well. Records current and future intention to implement IPM. We conducted interviews for this study and found that the key barriers to uptake of IPM practice were economic. So we're looking now at what economic incentives could be introduced to encourage further IPM uptake, and lack of knowledge and understanding of IPM. So hopefully we can develop better knowledge transfer and exchange programs to change mindset and habits, and coupled with the economic incentives that should hopefully encourage IPM uptake across the board. So we have a tool, the IPM assessment plan, which assesses overall strategy. It's useful to benchmark it against yourself so you can see hopefully continued improvement over time. But also in future, we're hoping to adjust the plan so that you can benchmark yourself against others, whether that be national, regional, and we're yet to sort of define that. By doing this, it's a very simple, not an onerous task. You can develop these action plans to increase IPM adoption. There's also, if you're interested as well, you could look at the crop-specific IPM plans, which will be launched soon. And that offers you a more detailed sort of planning tool you can assess what worked, look back and assess what worked, and hopefully through that process develop next steps to further improve your IPM adoption. Overall, this should lead to a reduction in risks associated with pests and pesticides. Before we go, I just want to make the point that IPM adoption is a responsibility of not just the farmer and the agronomist, and there are various key players that influence IPM decisions, and some of them may be regulatory, some of them may be market driven. There's a lot of power in the hands of the retailers and exporters and processors and that. And if they put more demands on the farmer, then it's important the farmer is rewarded for those taking those extra steps. So, and any risks associated with adoption of certain IPM practices could then be shared more consistently across the supply chain. And hopefully economic incentives that should be introduced in a few years' time will also go away some way to reducing that risk for the farmer. So I'd like to finish by thanking everyone involved, particularly Spencer Collins at the NFU and Elliot Medder, who crunched a lot of the numbers for the charts you've seen today, but also everyone involved in the IPM assessment plan and the test and trial project. And I'd like to thank you for your time.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Henry. That's fantastic. While Yelto just uploads his slides for the next class, I'm going to ask you one question to bridge the gap, if that's okay. Hazel asks, Henry, you suggested that there's a preference for IPM adopters to choose an independent agronomist. However, does analysis of the data from the VI IPM returns show a statistically significant difference? The box and whisker chart doesn't appear to reflect this. What are your thoughts?
I suppose it depends where you're putting those cutoffs. If you're looking at those top adopters and the bottom adopters, in terms of the upper and lower quartile, previous studies have found that there was a significant difference, but it's hard to say on that sliding scale. It's hard to determine if there was a difference when looking at all of the results together in the same table. I think if you probably would separate them out, there probably would be something significant, but it wasn't a massive difference. If you look at the overall data, you're looking at a small amount, and there's various reasons, as we said before, for that preference. It doesn't make any estimate of the type of advice that's given by the different types of agronomist. It may be simply the fact that that those lower adopters, typically smaller farms, have less capacity to buy in that extra advice.
Thank you very much, Henry, and we'll come back to you at the end if that's okay in the panel session.
Thank you, Richard.
What that leads me to do is then to take us straight into Yelto's presentation today. As I mentioned, Yelto joins us from the Agri Benchmark Network, which is based in Germany, and we've really tasked him today to kind of share with us how does the UK look in the international scene, how do we compare, and how can we be competitive. Yelto, I don't want to eat into any more of your valuable time. Can I pass the stage over to you?
Yeah, Richard, first of all, thank you very much for this very kind introduction, and also for the opportunity to present to you and your clients some of the insights that we are able to draw from our work. I need to warn you that now from these very technical, detailed related topics that have been presented so far, we will make a sharp shift into more a global overview on key production economics, and that will be my topic. So how does the UK compare international in terms of wheat and rapeseed? I prepared an agenda which starts with a few words on Agri Benchmark so that you can put my words into perspective. I will then focus on the UK and global wheat production economics, talk briefly about UK and rapeseed, and then we'll try to draw some conclusions for the strategic positioning of crop production in the UK. So Agri Benchmark is a global initiative of producers and scientists in crop production. We are a non-profit network of about 60 plus economists from all over the world. We use the internationally standardized methods, the so-called typical farm approach, to analyze production systems and their profitability. Of course, we combine our farm level expertise with know-how in international commodity markets and value chains, because we are aware that growers are not isolated sitting on their farm, but rather are interlinked through commodity markets. And we claim that we thereby are able to provide scientifically consistent and soundly based answers on strategic issues for decision makers in farming, agribusiness, and policy. So that gives you a small impression from one of our previous meetings in the Borlaug Center in Iowa. We have an annual meeting where all the partners come together and discuss latest results and developments. This is the coverage that we are able to talk about today. So you can see that basically all the major producers in the world are presented in our database, and also all the major crops, be it wheat and rapeseed, but also sugar beet, corn, and all the other crops mentioned on the left-hand side. Yeah, just a brief overview on our partners. And on the very left corner of this slide, you can see, so in the UK, we work together both with Cambridge University, but also with AHDB. So some of the data that I will be presenting to you has been generated and provided to us by AHDB. Yeah, these are the partners in other parts of the world. Just to give you an idea, I will today only talk about a very small part of our database and of our expertise. In order to give you an idea about what we are able to do, I just quote a number of projects that we have been doing. So we did work on Russian oilseed production. We did a global study on upside potential in yields. We are doing a project on economics of reduced crop protection product usage in German production. We are involved in analysis on how crop farms can mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. So that seems to be a very topical issue for you guys as well. And we are about to start a project on the design and evaluation of improved arable production systems to manage legal and agronomic challenges. And we did some work on variable rate application of fertilizers. And last but not least, we are involved in a global monitoring project of fertilizer usage at the farm level with the International Fertilizer Association. And most recently, we started a project on the economics of spot spread. So enough advertising. I will jump now into the subject of wheat production and how the UK compares. I think to put the whole story into a perspective, I start my presentation with an overview. What are the big players in global wheat markets? And as you can see here from this slide, the elephant in the room is Russia. As you can see, they have experienced a very steep increase in their presence in global markets, and they surpassed the US already like 5 years ago as the leading wheat exporter. And then, of course, we have a number of other players: Ukraine, European Union, Canada, Australia, and Argentina. I now turn to the farm level part, and what you can see here, and the logic will always be the same in the subsequent slides, is that on the bottom line axis you see codes which represent the name of our typical farms, and you have to read them like this. So take the example on the very left hand side, CA 1100 NWM stands for Canada. The 1100 indicates the size of the farm, so 1100 hectare always. And then NWM stands for Northwest Manitoba. And I don't go through all the list, but I will highlight the 3 British farms we have in our comparison. So this one is a 440 hectare farm in Suffolk. We have a 310 hectare farm in Wash, and we have a 270 hectare farm in Scotland. And this first slide is meant to give you an idea about the importance of wheat, because we have to be aware that wheat is very different in terms of its importance to farms. So you can see the extreme here in this comparison is the Suffolk and the German Hildesheimer farm, which have basically 60% of their total acreage is produced, is farmed with wheat. And then on the other hand of the spectrum, we have farms like the one in the US, like in Indiana, but also in Ukraine, where the share of wheat is very, very low. But what is very important for this comparison is that the alternatives are very different. So while in the US and in Ukraine and also in Russia, the key alternative for producers is corn. So meaning a very productive, very well-established product. In other farms, especially also the two British farms, the alternative crops are specialty crops with, of course, a very diversified production system, so such as potato or sugar beets, but which are, of course, not available to everybody. So that very much depends on market conditions and natural conditions. So then the first insight on the yield, which is important, of course, in order to understand the production systems. You can see that in this comparison, the British farms together with the German and the French farms are by far the leading ones with about 9 tons to the hectare yield, whereas we have Ukraine, Russia, and Poland with yield levels of about 5 to 6 tons. And at the very low end of the spectrum, we have Canadian and US farms about 4 tons to the hectare. These differences are, as you may guess, primarily driven by natural conditions, meaning precipitation and the duration of the length of the vegetation period. However, in Russia, those yield levels are also still impacted by deficits in production systems and input usage. So I would guess that there is still some room for improvement. Just one key factor, of course, both from environmental standpoint as well as from economics, is the use of fertilizer. And I here focus on nitrogen. And you can see that according to the differences in yield levels, we also have a significant variation in input. So it goes from about 70 kgs in one of the Canadian farms in the prairies up to more than 200 kgs in the UK and in some of the German farms. But when it comes to economics and environmental effects from fertilization, you can see that there are significant differences in the productivity. So that means how many kgs of grain are produced per kg of nitrogen. So the majority of farms are in the range of 30 to 50 kgs per kg of nitrogen. However, we do also have some outliers on the upper level as well as on the lower level. As far as the UK is concerned, I think it's fair to say that the UK farms tend to be in the upper level, or at least in the middle of the spectrum that we have in our comparison. For the economics, of course, the understanding of prices is important. And what you can see here, in principle, we have a strong variation in end prices. However, I need to highlight that on those two German farms, there is also significant input from organic fertilizers, so therefore, and which are, of course, cheaper than mineral fertilizers. Therefore, this average price is not representative. But still, we can see that the British farms tend to pay relatively high prices for nitrogen compared to the others in this comparison. If you wonder about the two Russian farms here in the middle of my slide, we need to keep in mind that Russia is a net exporter of crude oil and energy, and therefore domestic prices are low. And plus, they have a significant domestic production, whereas most or many other countries have to import nitrogen, so therefore export parity prices are relevant for the Russian. So now the first really hardcore economic analysis. I should highlight that this is what we call the crop establishment cost, and that is for in US dollar per hectare for the average for 2018 to 2020. And what you can see here is that that's on a per hectare basis, so no big surprise that the difference are significant because taking into consideration the difference in yield. As in yields, UK, French, and German farms exhibit the highest input cost on a per hectare basis. It seems to me that UK farms are particularly high in crop protection, both for herbicides as well as in fungicides. When it comes to comparison, of course, in an international perspective, it does not matter that much how much people spend on per hectare basis, but how much do they spend on a per ton basis, which is why I created this slide here. And I differentiated total cost into three categories. I calculated direct cost per ton, operating cost, which is machinery depreciation, labor, and fuel and additives. If you look at the direct cost per ton, it is fair to say that the UK is basically at the same level as most of the Western producers. The only farms which really stick out here are the farms from Russia and Ukraine. When it comes to operating cost, we have a rather similar situation, that the UK is at the same level as Western producers. We have a slightly different situation when it comes to land cost per ton. Here, the UK is slightly lower than Germany in this comparison. When talking total cost, then of course it's also important to understand what are the revenues generated. So what is the price of the output? And we also still have to consider the revenue from decoupled payments. And this is here again displayed now, but differentiated for what we call cash cost, depreciation on machinery, and so-called opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is accounted for labor, capital, and land that belongs to the farm. So that does not incur immediate cash expenses, but of course, in the long run, have to be calculated in order to make an economic living from the activities. And what you can see is that the UK farms, under the current pricing situation of about 230 plus minus US dollar per ton of wheat in this comparison, they are break even, including opportunity cost, we're in the current situation. And as you can see from some of the German examples, but also from one of the Polish farms here, and also from the Ukrainian farm, this is not a given. So, and also the two US farms are not able to cover total cost, including opportunity cost. But the other thing which becomes very obvious here, especially for Russia, is that they are by far on a per ton basis, they are the cost leader in terms of most competitive producers. But the other thing which is also highlighted, has to be highlighted here, that they have about $50 lower farm gate prices compared to all the others in this comparison. One important figure when calculating the economics of crop production is what we call the return to land. So that means if you pay all the costs that you have, excluding land rents, what is available to remunerate the land. And as you can see here, 2 of the 3 British farms perform fairly good. So their return to land is higher than their land rent. So that means there is an entrepreneurial profit to be made. However, the farm in the Wash region, at least in wheat, that is very important. So in this farm, wheat is not very important. So we have to assume that in other crops, the return to land is much higher. And that would be true for a lot of other farms in this comparison. So it's just a part of the whole story to consider here, the return to land from wheat. What is important if you compare with France, so here you have this really very high return to land and very low land rent. This is because the French politicians heavily intervene into land markets. So that is not a good benchmark for you. But I would also highlight the fact that in Germany, with comparable yields, the land rents are much, much higher than in the UK. Yeah, some key findings from my side. In terms of wheat yields, UK is one of the most productive sites globally. No big surprise, I guess. The dependence on wheat for the Wash and Scottish farms are low. In Suffolk, it's very high. And prices and seed prices comparatively high for UK farms. Despite high inputs in N and productivity on UK farms is in the upper level of the comparison. And the major competitive edge of Russian farms are low end prices and still high end productivity. So I'm now turning to the rapeseed part of the analysis. Here I start with a slide on the evolution of land use for rapeseed. And I'm aware that the UK has experienced significant decrease in rapeseed acreage, but that is also true for many other European countries. There has been in 2021 a slight recovery, which is not included in this stat, but still we witnessed a reduction of about 20% in only in 1 year. However, when it comes to global markets and exports, it is a much less diverse situation as compared to wheat. We basically only have 3 major players, which is Canada, Australia, and Ukraine. And Canada is by far the biggest exporter of rapeseed in global markets. Yeah, when it comes to rapeseed yields, you can see this comparison. So the British farms on the right-hand side tend to perform relatively good in this comparison, in particular the Scottish farms. So that's probably nice news for many of your participants here. However, in the long run, UK rapeseed yields have been about 0.5 tons lower than in Germany or Denmark. Keep in mind that these 2018 to 2020 include 2 very poor yields for continental European farms. I'm not sure about the UK, but that is something which I wanted to mention. Yeah, also, of course, in rapeseed, N input is important, probably even more important than in rapeseed. And you can see here that a lot of producers in Germany and France and Poland and in the UK are in the vicinity of applying 200 kgs in rapeseed. And but what you can see here as well, as no big surprise for experts in rapeseed production, the productivity is basically half of what it is in rapeseed. So the range is in between 12 to 20, 15 to 20 kgs. And again, I think it's a fair statement to say that except for the Suffolk farm, the 2 British farms perform very good. One is really outstanding with about almost 25 kgs per kg of nitrogen. When it comes to rapeseed establishment cost, we have a similar picture as far as input chemical is concerned. The spending from UK farms are relatively high, similar situation as in wheat. However, I would like to highlight that the seed cost on British farms are lower than most of the competitors, especially compared to Germany and Canada. However, in Canada, you need to keep in mind that a lot of the production is also herbicide resistant, which means that part of the value of the herbicide management is included in the seed, so that makes the comparison a little bit shaky. Yeah, here I have the same picture. Again, the key cost items on a per ton basis comparison. These are the direct cost on a per ton basis. So we are talking in the range of 150, slightly above 150 as the benchmark. And in this comparison, it's fair to say that the UK is doing pretty well. When it comes to operating cost, again, the British farms compare nicely to these in these comparisons, and the only somehow limited competitiveness is in land cost. Here, the British farms are not at the forefront, I would say. Again, when it comes to total cost and revenue, we can see that despite high commodity farms, UK farms are just break even. But again, we need to keep in mind that German and Polish farms are similar or even worse. And despite much lower prices, same picture as in wheat, Ukrainian farms are very profitable and very competitive. And I guess that is one of the reasons why we see this growth in Ukrainian rapeseed production and exports into Europe. Yeah, a few take-home messages from my side. I hope that they make sense to you. Our data for 2018 to 2020 indicates UK production systems in wheat and rapeseed are rather competitive relative to EU producers. But what will happen to yield if yield disadvantages in rapeseed, whether they will continue or whether the continental European producers will return to previous levels. However, compared to Russia and Ukraine in particular, but also relative to Canada and US, there are some cost disadvantages. However, I would state that regarding trade, one only has to care about Russia and Ukraine as really strong competitors on international markets. UK farms are at wheat prices of $230 per ton and $450 per ton in rapeseed. Just break even without decoupled payments. With less bullish markets, I think it's fair to assume that this will create substantial pressure on margins. However, that will be, of course, true also for many continental producers as well. Yeah, I think if you think about potential room for improvements in the UK, I think the fertilizer prices, as well as the relatively high expenditures on crop production, might indicate some room for improvement. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Yelto. It was mind-blowing and put it all in perspective, seeing it in that context, and thank you very much. What I'll do now is ask all of our panel and speakers to come back onto the virtual stage now, and we've got a few questions mounted up, and I'll come to all of you in one go, if that's okay. So we're going to be jumping around a bit here, and so right, this is one for Julian. Are you there, Julian? Popping up. I might have to get another one.
Yes.
Oh, there you are.
Sorry, I couldn't get my legs to work.
Pick up. Right. one for Julian. If we are to achieve net zero, we do need businesses to carry out annual carbon audits. They know whether they're operating at a carbon surplus or a deficit, and then buy or either sell additional units accordingly. Not necessarily, in my view, something I've heard being discussed. So it's not really a question, it's a comment, isn't it? Right. This is one for Ian and Andrew. Although foliar applied N products with the appropriate formulations can be hugely more efficient in getting N into the crop in a more crop usable form, it is not possible to feed through the leaves the total quantity of N required by the growing crop. Do you agree? George, sorry, not Andrew, George. Sorry, George.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah. Do you want me to pick that up?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we've only just worked with one product, so I think you pull out an important point there. I mean, we didn't see any evidence of that with the one product that we use, but formulations may make a difference. Yes, getting sufficient N through the leaves to satisfy the crop will be a challenge. Let's assume they are, you can use them efficiently. And that's why I think the approach that's been advocated, and it's a sensible one, is that you have soil applied N to start with, because you've got to generate a sufficient canopy size in order to be able to intercept it. But then you've still got the problem of getting the nitrogen through the leaves to where it's needed in the right kind of quantities. And you have to do that without scorching the crop as well. So I think historically when urea's just been used as a foliar feed, there have been problems in dry weather, because you would imagine this would be actually quite a good way of doing things in dry weather when we have very dry springs and summers, but that can lead to scorch problems as well. So those kind of factors have to be balanced up. But I would, I'm keen to look at a bigger range of products and then actually measure the amount of nitrogen that's getting in, so that we can do the right kind of calculations on the relative efficiencies. And we've still to do that yet with in the next year of the project.
There's a couple of people asking about nitrogen inhibitors, Ian, and whether they increase the nitrogen level in malting barley. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I haven't worked with the nitrogen inhibitors. My colleague Bob Rees has. I think what we have to be careful with when we're thinking about the inhibitors is that they from the data I've seen, if we're thinking about nitrification inhibitors, they don't. The main benefit is in reducing nitrous oxide emissions, not in terms of the amount of nitrogen that gets into the crop, I don't think. So I don't think it should inherently have a significant impact. The benefit is actually just keeping it more in the ammonium form and not the nitrate form. Ammonium can be taken up directly by the crop as well as the nitrate form. So if you just minimize that transformation, you reduce your nitrous oxide emissions, but it doesn't actually have a huge effect on the overall nitrogen budget of the crop.
Brilliant. Julian, I'll try again with this question. Do we need all businesses to carry out annual carbon audits so they know if they are a net emitter or sequester of greenhouse gases, so that they can take action accordingly if we are able to achieve net zero?
Well, yeah, there needs, if we're going to achieve targets for whatever reason and to whatever degree, we need to know where we are. So we need a way of measuring that, and we need a way of measuring that is going to reflect any improvements or changes that the farm does. So which can bring a bit more complexity than perhaps people might always like in terms of time and things like that. But obviously over time, then perhaps more the scope to bring in more digital data, sensor data, and things like that. So yeah, it will need data. That can be over time. Technology can make that easier. But yeah, it's like looking that way, given the way that funding, government funding, and even supplying into different markets are going to need, an accurate record of what the farmer is achieving. Brilliant.
Two quick ones for you, George. Firstly, a very quick one. What is the approximate cost of testing slurry and FYM?
Off the top of my head, I would put it somewhere between £50 and £100. But contact your service provider basically beforehand regarding the container it's to travel in. That's very important, because remember, it's got a long distance. But that's, off the top of my head, that's where it would be. Maybe a wee bit more if you are looking at some of the products that you're maybe concerned about for heavy metals or something like that. But that ballpark, 50 to 100.
Also, there's no mention of phosphate enhancers, for example, available P reserve, liquid P release. They can cut fertiliser P input by 30 to 50% and maintain the available P to the crop. What do you think? What are your thoughts to that?
Well, I was going on what the recommended amount is. These products, they are used. We've got growers that do use them, certainly potato growers. I'm not sure so many growers that are using them for cereals. Potatoes obviously got a bigger requirement for P. Then it comes into more of its own there. I'm not sure for the cereals if there's so much of a benefit. But hey, if it improves it, and and if it's proven, then that's a different kettle of fish.
Brilliant, thank you. One for Yelto. Yelto, do the figures do they include subsidies given to farmers? And I think the question's alluding to, are there big differences between the subsidies in the nations in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, you have probably seen, I forgot to mention that in one of my slides for each of the two crops, I had these green dots which indicated the total revenue, including direct payments. Mm-hmm. So these subsidies are included, but they are not included in the market revenue, but as a separate item. Mm-hmm. We do have implicit subsidies primarily in Russia, where the capital for purchasing machinery is partially heavily subsidized. That has been reduced a little bit in recent years, but so therefore the operating costs are lower than they would have been without a subsidy. Does that answer the question?
No, that's fine. But yeah, thank you, Yoko. Right. Another one for Henry. Henry, are there threshold levels for beneficials in a field that mean that we don't need to use an insecticide? There are plenty around for pest thresholds for spraying insecticides, but does it work the other way around? I think that's what's going on. I suppose we have thresholds for pollen beetles, don't we? And when you do spraying, does it work in the other direction?
Yes, I believe people are actually looking at this. The issue is that usually by the time you've got the predators, certainly if they're predating on specific pests, there's not going to be the level of predators initially there to control those pests because they've got no food. We've seen this a lot when people have tried to introduce, say, lacewing larvae or whatever in a field to control aphids. You can put them there, but unless you've got the habitat, the food to keep them there in the field, they'll leave the system. And that gets into a tricky situation there. Then how many, you're not going to have for example, ladybird level at that threshold before the pest has got there. So it's about timing in terms of damage. But I believe there are I mentioned those test and trial projects that are funded by DEFRA. I believe there are others who have similar, more biodiversity sort of targeted projects looking at these sorts of things. But yeah, it's a tricky question.
Brilliant, thank you. I think this is one for George, possibly. Should N rates be adjusted if straw was incorporated?
I think there is a bit of there is a bit of lock up, but I think it comes back again. The nitrogen comes back again. So no, I would say it will come back. Is that fair to say, Ian?
Oh, I think you're on mute, Ian.
Hey, there had to be somebody, didn't there? There had to be somebody. Yeah, no, I would agree. If you look at the sort of immobilization and then remineralization, it can come back later on in the year. I suppose it comes down to timing and also quantities of in terms of the amount of straw that's going back. There's been some work done recently, I think, sort of looking at this in relationship to timing, where they've been actually applying sugars deliberately to try and manipulate the nitrogen cycle in the soil to create a big lockup. But I'd need to go and check that. That's ADAS work. I'll try and dig out a reference. I think it was it an AHDB funded project? I'm not sure. I'll need to check. Yeah. But no, typically you would expect it to be locked up temporarily and then released again later on. So it depends on what crop you're growing and what your timing is to whether you would need to make a big adjustment. But
would you expect there to be any impact on the disease levels according to the N levels applied? Would you see a relationship there?
Yes. Sorry, do you want me to have a go? And then maybe Henry can kick in with this, because you've actually been trialing this, haven't you, Henry? I think my view has been, and I'm not sure this is entirely correct, is that yes, nitrogen content in the crop can affect the amount of disease. But primarily, you kind of, it's when you're reaching a point when the crop has already, where its nutritional requirements have already been met, that you start to see the big increases in disease susceptibility. I don't know whether you would agree with that, Henry, or not. So I think, you've got to get your crop nutrition right first and then worry about what's happening with the disease afterwards.
Yeah, I'd agree. Particularly if the canopy is a bit overdeveloped from an excess supply of nitrogen or high seed rates, perhaps in combination with that. It's got a thick, lush canopy, little air movement, lots of humidity. It drives a lot of diseases, particularly things like mildews and things like that will run rampant in really lush crops of, say, winter barley. There's also the added effect on weeds as well, an oversupply of nutrients, potentially in those areas where you've got low crop density, means there's more nutrients available to weeds. So you're potentially likely to see weed issues in those areas as well.
Thank you, Henry. Julian, one for you. When we're looking at the agriculture figures and or other tools are available, you can see in arable systems that the fertiliser is really kind of one of the key areas there. Who takes responsibility for the fertilisers footprint itself? Are the manufacturers, does that stop at the farm gate when it enters the farm? And are the manufacturers doing anything on their end to reduce their footprint of that fertiliser that would impact the industry?
Okay, so in terms of, from the government's point of view, and the national inventory, which puts the economy in sort of sectors, silos, you might say, the part that the farmers are actually responsible for, according to the policymakers, is when you apply the fertiliser and those emissions come off, so the nitrous oxide. So in that context, the farmers aren't actually responsible for the manufacture of the fertiliser. If you are working on a life cycle approach, which in terms of the products going through to, say, a supermarket, then the farm would have to account for the energy, etc., used to produce the fertiliser, because they're trying to demonstrate what their overall product emissions are. And so and in terms of the manufacturers, they are, the ones in the UK and Europe are quite making fairly well reported steps to cut carbon, and they have got some regulatory carbon sort of tax type issues that sort of pushing them down that route to cut emissions from their processes. So there is a bit of a competition there, but I suppose from the farmer point of view, there's not a lot stopping boatloads of Egyptian urea coming in and things like that. So I think there are limits to how far the EU manufacturer will go, or UK, until they've got some assurance that they just won't be undercut by other suppliers.
Brilliant. Thank you, Julian. So there is a shift towards environmentally awareness in UK farming in policy and in practice. Do you feel that will improve the productivity of of us as a nation participating in the figures?
Oh, that's a big question. The problem is that this is a moving target question, because we, as you probably all are aware, also in continental Europe, we have a lot of changes in the legal framework conditions. So, of course, that is not true for Ukraine and Russia, and only partially true for Canada and the US. So, in principle, I would assume that these regulations put pressure on margins, because they restrict the use of crop protection products, they reduce the use of fertilizers. So in general, I think the tendency to put pressure is higher than the efficiency gains, which are also available. Consider the possibilities to reduce nitrogen fertilization without a significant yield drop. But in general, I would assume that this is not improving the overall competitiveness of countries.
Thank you. But well answered, a very big question. One for you, George. With precision farming and yield monitoring, we've always faced the dilemma of whether to push the poorer areas with more nitrogen, or use the poorer areas with less nitrogen because the response to the N is poor. Does the high price make that decision easier for us, do you think?
Yes, I think so. I think, like I said, my topic, I mean, I think it's going to become a year that you're going to have to judge it in the field. And those low yielding areas quite likely are going to be visible, especially if they're really quite low yielding, and you know, the opportunity is going to be there to make the cost. If it's not going to be a bumper yield, why throw the nitrogen at it? And at the same time, you know, it comes back to the cost. If you think the crop's got good potential, yeah, that's the bits to look after.
Brilliant, thank you, George. That takes us just over the 1 o'clock finish time, so I'm gonna let everybody rest there and thank all our panel very, very much for. I've made reams of notes here. There's been so many take-home points, and I hope that you've all benefited from it as well. Like I said at the beginning, this will be recorded, so you can revisit any of it at any time to see again. All it leaves me to do is remind you that on the 26th of January is the final instalment of this, and that's the bite-sized sessions with farmer case studies involved in there. And to thank all our panel speakers today for all the effort they've gone to for putting this all together. It's not it's not simple to do, and they're all very nerve-wracking having questions coming from all directions when you're online. So I appreciate it, everybody, for their willingness and for doing it online. And also to thank Gemma in the background and Fiona Burnett. Fiona's helped pull us all together and give us all to the same place on the same day. So we're very grateful to everyone involved and to all the partners involved. So, and final thank you is to all of you, the audience, for so many questions and thoughts and challenges. So, wish you all a lovely afternoon, and hope to see you again next week. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Okay, all the best. Bye.
Thank you.
And thank you to you, Richard.
Yeah, cheers, Richard. Thanks everyone.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah.
Thank you.